And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already tonight. And as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, pretty wild week.
Yes.
I have to say, they just activated CERN, reactivated today on 2/4/22. So think about that. Think about some of the implications. Are you feeling that vibration?
I've been feeling incredibly bombarded by cosmic rays personally, and exhausted from dealing with it.
Is that an astrological thing?
No, it's the part of the solar system, the galaxy that we're moving through. We're all being bombarded by cosmic rays. It can account for a lot of things, a lot of shifts in our
Seems like things are shifting this week quite a bit. It's been that kind of a week. And, people have been ticking off that this whole move of the wokeness getting the boot here and there is a good sign.
Amen.
And I always say, once they're on the ropes, keep going. That's when you take them down. No let up, as they say in boxing. And we are seeing some signs of that, just as we're seeing a whole digital ID system rolled out in Europe. So it's like a mixed bag of what's happening. And so many people have been sending me emails about Elon Musk.
Yes.
We get into Musk. We did a show recently about Musk, and Musk is very much a mystery in the mold of Howard Hughes, et cetera. But we can't look to people like that to save the system. And it's the richest man in the world. He got there through compromised means and methods. It doesn't mean that there isn't a group inside that is very, disturbed about the results of the COVID op and just the insanity of the woke thing and the emergency powers and the COG approach and the Stepford Biden rollout and crazy Kamala and the whole thing. They've just had enough of it, even though they're part of it. So they want to boot that end and come out and look a little more chic and come up with some better policies. But it hardly means that they're in a position to provide the kind of grassroots change that's necessary. And that's what we're really looking for. And politics is going to play a really big role this year. But tonight, we're going to get into the hot zone, and we are going into X Series 124. This is the deep state in the hot zone. We're looking at Robert Vesco, the criminal financier with close ties to President Nixon, who spent the better portion of his late life in Cuba, and close, having lived with Nixon's nephew for some, drumroll please, 14 years.
Wow.
Think about that. That's quite an influence there. But his presence in the hot zone with Frank Turple, who was a rogue CIA agent who decided to go undercover and support other rogue nations, is very interesting. And how they get mixed up in the 1990s promoting a miracle AIDS drug becomes very, very fascinating and a key to many of the things that we see in the hot zone. And I have to say, after we did the 4-year anniversary special and we had the hot zone episode there, that one rounded out a lot of the Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein piece to the hot zone and what's going on in relation to those types of deep state moves and what was happening there with their search for Atlantis and the kind of mythology that they had built up in it. But the story of the hot zone, of course, is very interesting, and it's a regular feature. I rolled it out here in 2018, and I'd done a lot of research around it, but at a certain point, I had been contacted and been given information about how an area there near the Bahamas, between the Bahamas and Cuba and Florida, was called the hot zone. And this came up a couple of times for me, and I became very interested in it in relation to the Atlantis Rising work in the Cayce material. And I always like to orient everyone with this map. That is the hot zone. This is the area that we're talking about. And what's interesting about it, of course, is that off of Bimini, which is in here, it's a slide up here, that's where the Sleeping Prophet Edgar Cayce said we were going to have land rising and temples rising in relation to the sunken culture of Poseidia, which was a major factor at the end of the Atlantean age and era. Now, we've seen in traditional history that they go back and forth on when things started, but Atlantis is not something that they ever try to live up to, and they won't accept in traditional archaeology. However, everything that they've been finding now is pretty much bearing out all the things that the mystery schools, like Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, Edgar Cayce, and Theosophy, came forward and said, look, Atlantis was a big part of our past. It's a lost chapter. We were very advanced then, spiritually and technologically, and the whole thing went down. And it took the story of Plato, verbatim. It took it as literal instead of an allegory. Now, what happened as we got along through time is a lot of theories about Atlantis came up, and then a lot of junk conspiracy too. Like, hey, look, there's some, volcano, and that's Atlantis, So just a lot of stuff. But over and over again, when you look at the record and the research around Atlantis, you find it situated between the Gulf of Mexico on one side and the Mediterranean on the other. And of course, Plato himself places it past the Pillars of Hercules. That's the Atlantic Ocean. So that's where we take our real cue from. There's a sunken version of an advanced culture that's lost to history in the Pacific. That's called Mu or Lemuria. And also very interesting and a little bit older. So what we have with Atlantis, though, is that antecedent culture that got us the Mayan culture and got us the Egyptian culture, and all of these advanced kind of pieces. And when we look at Cayce's story, it's going to form a very crucial aspect of understanding what the hot zone is all about. Because in Cayce's story of Atlantis, the dominant part, the most spiritual, the most highly evolved aspect of Atlantis was there in the Bahamas. And that area was called Poseidia. And what happened was a group inside Atlantis used a massive power crystal against them and caused it to sink, and caused the island and the side that they were on as well to sink. So, and Tuai is very important in its research we've brought forward on this program from the Edgar Cayce readings directly, because it's just been sitting out there as this name with no real context. A few people, I found out, a NASA scientist, for example, took a crack at it. And he came up with some very interesting designs about the kind of power station that it could have been, giving it a very, very realistic, modernistic treatment. But Tuai, again, is Tuaoi, and Cayce spelled it out in the readings that way so we would understand and be able to follow up on it. Unfortunately, no one ever did, basically, until we started doing it here. And in the work of Gigi Young, she's also done that. And what's been great about this is that there's a kind of a reemergence of this idea that they had this power crystal, and that the power station represented, it gave them the kind of technological advance to allow them to dominate the entire culture at the time, and that half of the group inside Atlantis, the Amelia's group, used it as a kind of a spiritual tool for evolution, and that the other group used it for kind of nuclear war. And that's the Belial group. So that's the story as it comes down to us. And when we get into this point where the deep state's involved in the hot zone, we find secrets flying around, because when you get down into Miami and Bimini and the Bahamas and Cuba and all these different places. I mean, look at a place like Haiti, which is run by criminal gangs. I get updates from Haiti all the time, and there are criminal gangs just running it outright in the street, which is remarkable.
There's no rule of law anymore.
Exactly. And that's kind of the point, which is once you get, this is true in the ocean as well, which is the rules as we understand them go out the window. So when we've pointed out this group, AUTEC, AUTEC, that operates, it's kind of the American Area 51 underwater, and it operates off Andros Island, which is part of this piece of Atlantis that's still above water. And there's so many interesting things that we're going to bring forward about Andros tonight and AUTEC, and how that corresponds to the presence of people like Robert Vesco, who was all around the Bahamas, but then eventually wound up in Cuba. And the fact that the Cuban city had been discovered under Fidel Castro around the year 2000, probably even earlier, and the findings of Polina Zalitsky, who we've profiled in this program a number of times, and who was basically driven out of that whole situation after she had found these massive ruins underwater off the western tip of Cuba. So the hot zone, fundamentally, just for anyone who hasn't seen the program, these people who go into that area, if they work for a government entity like the military, for example, or a private company, and they're mapping the ocean floor or doing something else, oil exploration, whatever it happens to be, they sign these various NDAs that tell them, look, if you see anything of an unusual nature, like ancient structures, pyramids, walls, temples, any of that stuff, you're allowed to report it to us, but it can't go public. And if it is, you're in violation of your NDA. You're subject, if you're in the military, to court-martial. You're subject to all these criminal penalties if you're doing it as part of a corporation. It's a pretty heavily held secret down there that this is the kind of thing that goes on. And the number of UFO reports in that area are off the charts. And it's amazing, you know, because they have us very often in the geography of the space of the UFO file. We're always looking around Nevada and these different places as the kind of UFO hotspots. And I can appreciate it because there's a number of weird things that have taken place there. But it's really, if you want to get into it, you know, you're going to be in the hot zone if you want the UFO file. And if you want the series of sightings on a regular basis and the documented cases going back 75 years. They've been trying to take our attention recently, that whole TTSA CIA part, and bring it over to San Diego. In fact, and off the coast of San Diego. But in fact, those very often are aerospace tests being done against the Navy. And then they roll out the Navy pilots and they say, what did you see? You know, after they did the op to them. So that's a little bit different. And they never mention Coronado, which is the core place that's launching the tests. And we've done a lot on Coronado. So a part of what we want to do here in the X series with everyone is to give you a new geography when looking at a number of these things, which is why I want to start off the show tonight with some interesting things that have come up in relation to some of the things that we presented here on the show. One of them, you might remember last summer, we did a series on the Cosmos Club. Remember all the interesting feedback on that? Like, really serious. We had people who had been there who, you know, were involved in all kinds of secret meetings involved. And it was like, just for heavy duty for about 4 to 6 weeks, we ran a couple of shows on the Cosmos Club. And the Cosmos Club, I had concluded, was basically a UFO Bilderberg. And as a UFO Bilderberg, it really had that idea that they could go there without the press being a part of it, and this press sworn to secrecy. And some of the really top people, like the Carl Sagans of the world, could get together with other UFO military experts and share intel. As a matter of fact, there was a concerted effort to boot Sagan because he was giving away those types of details. But we brought this to the surface, and the Cosmos Club had just been hanging out there as this kind of unknown. And we had threaded all these different photography experts and other people involved with the UFO file. So Rand Paul comes out and he's talking about our friend Anthony Fauci, good old Anthony Fascist Fauci. And he says, how did EcoHealth Alliance convince Fauci to give them over $100 million? This is what he tweeted from his own account. And he says, well, an invitation from the Cosmos Club and ... And he goes into a lot about Fauci, of course, and he said that he knows that Fauci belongs in prison, etc. But what's interesting is that reference to the Cosmos Club. This is where those types of deals take place, which is what makes it uniquely ideal for a UFO Bilderberg. So getting that kind of thing, that inside those situations, inside the Senate, you know, the Rand Pauls of the world understand that those things are going on inside the Cosmos Club. In this case, a very shady pharmaceutical deal. Tesla, you know, it's very important to remember with all the things around Musk that they've been doing a couple of things in the news media generally. One of them is promoting Musk as a kind of space president, right? So we get into a war in Ukraine, and Russia is, basically afraid of the idea of NATO on their doorstep or of Ukraine being nuclear. And they roll in there mercilessly, and they, basically they're looking to make Ukraine completely not a threat to them and also maybe a satellite state. It's very tricky what's going on there. There's a lot of different mixed emotions about it. However, in any case, it's not wise generally in foreign policy to provoke an adversary by putting something on their doorstep. Just look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that whole situation, there's a lot of blame on both sides there, but nonetheless, there should be a peace process involved, and we should be negotiating our way out. You don't hear anything about a peace process. This government enjoys the prospect of endless military-industrial complex buildup around Russia, and Russia, doing everything that they can, probably seizing the opportunity of being lured into this situation, but they're also, taking advantage. So we have a lot there on both sides, and what you need is international pressure for a peace deal, which there is none. So it's quite interesting. But one of the things that did happen, which I thought was interesting right at the beginning, and we interviewed Dr. Joseph Farrell on this recently, which is quite good, which was Musk showed up in the middle of that and said, hey, I'm going to keep Starlink for you, Ukraine, in case Russia takes down the internet, which really is kind of interfering. It's the one thing that the United States says as part of our military aid package, we're going to secure this, but this is a private company. And for him to be going over there and doing that, and for Ukraine's government, which has a lot of dubious factors in there, to give him the thumbs up and say, thanks, Elon, we're right there with you, sets a really bad precedent. What's next? Jeff Bezos with troops, and tags coming in. I mean, so we have to know where they're leading us on this. And then right after that, boom, Elon shows up with the Twitter thing, and he starts saying, I'm your guy. So we have to be very careful of that. And what's interesting is in X steganography, with SpaceX and everything else, they've been in the heart of it. And X steganography, in this case, the way that we've pointed it out, relates to a lot of different technology, advanced technology that's moved through different government agencies, public, private, and has the ability to be hidden that way, but those on the inside know what they're talking about. So we have someone like Musk, before he does SpaceX, having X.com, we have to know that he's right at the heart of all this X steganography relation to advanced technology. And so what we have when we look at Musk, when he comes out and he says, well, there might be consolidation of the company in the future. And a lot of people come out and say, what we've been hearing about is this one X company that will oversee all the things he's doing, Tesla, SpaceX, Boring, the whole bit. And it'll all be right there in X. And right in the Tesla daily briefing, someone sent me this today, they have Tesla X Holdings. That X Holdings will become the main body that controls the entire thing. And in the meantime, they're electing, the richest man in the world as some kind of space king. So the X steganography, and the way that they're rolling these things out, we're right in the heart of them trying to do this shift. And there's a lot of different moves. There's the old communist style move through Biden, Stepford Biden and Kamala and all that. And then there's this thing, which is supposed to be new and different. And yet we didn't elect Elon anything. So, we have to be aware of a lot of those moves as we move forward here. And another thing that kind of really made me laugh today was when this came out, Obama, disinformation is killing people. This from the guy who basically blew up Libya. I mean, and Libya hadn't done anything to us except agree to give up its weapons of mass destruction. So thanks, Obama, for handing the entire economy over to Larry Summers here at Harvard. I know your position as a clerk for the bankers was satisfied, and I hope that $50 million house over there on Martha's Vineyard is doing you well. By the way, his biggest concern is, not with hunger or, the state of people getting back to work or anything like that. It's about conspiracy theories, especially since, guess what? He's been the target himself.
Mm-hmm.
Poor Obama. Jeez. That's tough stuff. So maybe he'll come out against Stepford Biden in the middle of all this. But I did think that that represents, again, another shift that we're seeing there in that system, where the thing that they want to go after is the ability to call them out. And this is the censorship trip that we've been seeing that they've been on. And they think that they can save it because there's a lot of voices in that pack that are saying, we can't do this kind of control because it's making us look really bad, so much so that you get Jack Dorsey, ex-CEO of Twitter, coming out and saying, it wasn't my fault. They made me do it. CNN's bad. The Twitter board is bad, but I can't say anymore. So, you know, they did all this stuff. They rigged the election through these processes of preventing stories from coming out, like the Hunter Biden laptop. And they shut down the president's account, President Trump at the time, and they promoted blocking the New York Post, you know, all this type of stuff. And they're still shutting people down, but now there's some factor coming in that shows, oh, you know, now that people have really had a chance to look at this, people, no matter what, fundamentally believe in free speech, but it's also there embedded in the Constitution right off the bat. So when every official in the United States swears on board, every judge, every politician, that's what they're swearing on to. So when they make moves against free speech, woe betide. And these people are starting to realize, oh, we're looking bad. So that's where you're seeing that split. And they need to rebrand themselves as freedom, you know, for freedom and all this stuff. But in their heart of hearts, they just don't want you talking about these things. And that is where the nature of the battle lies. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 124, and we are getting tonight into the deep state hot zone. And it's interesting, through the figure of Robert Vesco, the criminal financier with close ties to President Nixon and close ties to his nephew, who he lived with for 14 years on record. Unbelievable. How do you live with someone for 14 years?
Well, you know what I said about it.
I know. There's all sorts of, you know, as usual, there's all sorts of rumors about Vesco because in that position, in that role, you know, there's so much blackmail involved, and sexual blackmail is right at the heart of it. But I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, even though that comes up. I'm going to go in a slightly direction with Vesco to see what he was actually doing in the hot zone. Because did you know he also tried to form a micronation called Aragon? And that has the overlay of New Atlantis from Lester Hemingway, and a lot of those people buying up lots in the Atlantic Ocean because they know land is rising. This is where a small group on the inside is weighing these things out. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program, and Miss Olivia is going to be putting those together. So you can ask them now, actually. And Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Good. Bill 33 wanted to remind us on the Cosmos Club website, there's a video of James Earl Jones talking about its history. James Earl Jones played Barney Hill in a TV movie from the 70s.
True. And Darth Vader.
That's true.
But that's a fantastic movie, actually.
I can watch that again and again and again. It won an Emmy, didn't it?
Well, it's TV movie. That's right. I think it did.
Was it Incident at Exeter? Is that it?
No, that's a really famous book. It's called The UFO Incident, actually. And Betty and Barney Hill, that story still resonates and echoes. And so no matter how much they screw up the UFO field by having all these CIA people in there and all the experts kissing up to the CIA people trying to get in on their documentaries and all that, it doesn't matter because the main cases are all there for us. So all we have to do is do the real UFO file research, and there's a great foundation out there for it. And we're expanding that conversation in ways that this kind of crazy TTSA fanboy kind of junk version, CIA junk version of the UFO file is just, you know, it's going to take it into this crazy fight. And because what they want to do, you know, they're so hell-bent on saving the UFO threat op that they tried to promote and they couldn't pull off in 2017. And this is what they've been trying to do. They've had various ways and means of doing that. But it's funny because when we get into tonight's show, the UFO file comes up a lot. When you get into the hot zone, the UFO file is major. But we're looking at it in terms of this Atlantis rising factor and this extensive ruins underground and the presence of the two-eyed stone and the message of the mystery schools. But let me tell you, like, this other factor that's hanging out there is just a heavy, heavy presence of the UFO file and the natives in the area as well. Those native cultures are very, very aware of it. On Bimini, of course, they call them fireflies. But they know them well. Okay, a couple of quick things off the bat. Of course, it's the story of Edgar Cayce. Cayce's story is very straight ahead on Bimini. And it's very mysterious in other ways because the group that came to him in the late 20s asked him in relation to treasure. They were curious about Bimini, and it was about treasure. And Cayce engaged a much larger conversation. And then this group became almost suspicious in that some of his reports, they always keep backup copies of the Cayce readings there. And those reports disappeared. So the second set of Bimini readings disappeared. The first set is very electric when you look at them now. And of course, he returned to this Bimini aspect over and over again. What's odd is there's very few people making any kind of noise about Bimini in that period. It's very obscure. It's not even well populated at all, and it's not built up practically at all. So why Cayce was making such a major case for it was he was saying, off the coast, you're going to see these temples of Poseidon arising, and that's going to be a big game changer because we're going to understand history completely differently. But he also had more to say about it. One of the things that he said was that the temple contained the Hall of Records, and that there were 3 halls of records that the Atlanteans left before their culture went down, one in Egypt under the Sphinx, one off the coast of Bimini, and one in the Yucatan in a temple. So those records are very important, but what's even more interesting is that they contain the description of the two-eye stone and its construction, according to Cayce. I believe that that is what got so many of these government agencies on this hunt about it. And the government aspect is on record. So it's not even something that we have to guess at. The CIA has already gone on record and said, look, what happened was, at a certain point in 1964, we placed agents inside the ARE to find out about the Hall of Records. That came out, and that original investigation. Later, Jim Semivan, just very recently, in the past 2 months, came out and talked about how someone who was very deep in doing undercover work at the CIA was attending UFO lectures at the ARE. So there's that presence again of the CIA around the Cayce Foundation. They're very curious about what they can get from that interaction. And in terms of the Hall of Records, it pertains to what they're doing there in the hot zone. Now, when you get, like I said, into places like Miami and Cuba and Bimini and Bermuda and the whole stretch of the Bahamas, you're looking at several things. You're looking at major drug running, and it's always been an aspect like that. During Prohibition, it was major bootlegging, and they had all their operations, and all those companies like Seagram's and all that stuff, they all grew up there and established presence there because they were big bootleggers. And all the mafia trip in relation to that as well. So you have that. You have human trafficking going through there. You have nations posed against each other. You've had things like, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which set the entire world on edge. And you have the whole Venezuela aspect, because Venezuela is close with Cuba. You have the Central American aspect, the Contras, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, all these different things, arms going in there, drugs, the Contras, cocaine. So this is all of that stuff because it has that Wild West thing. Underneath that, there's a geopolitical game in relation to the ruins and the discoveries in the hot zone of something. And I think I might be able to get at that something tonight through a very interesting work of somebody who was studying Autic, who was a British author. And I think it might give us a hint about not only the ruins that are down there, but this other thing, because again, remember, we've had on these shows big explanations about Thomas Townsend Brown and him spending all this time in San Antonio, Cuba, on the western tip again, and studying white sand and things of this nature. And we have the testimony of other people like Dr. David Zink, the late Dr. Zink, who went out into the Atlantic Ocean and compasses spin backwards, and whenever he's around this area between Cuba and Bimini. So they were aware of magnetic anomalies. So that aspect, the kind of, almost portal, open door, magnetic piece, goes along very well with the idea that CERN just got booted back up, because we're going to see that there's a lot of correspondence between what they're trying to do there. And you might say that the hot zone contains sort of a natural CERN, something where all of that magnetic interplay, portal opening happens on its own. It's not mechanically contrived like it is through a program like CERN, which is fascinating and shrouded in secrecy. And let's face it, $20 billion or not, who really even knows what it's about? I don't believe it's about finding the Higgs boson. Now they have a new thing. They're like, we're trying to find the fifth element in nature. I mean, they'll just make up anything that sounds good on the surface. And the press releases are always great too, because they're like, well, we're going to find those scientific results, correlate them with experts, give it out to the public, just like the most generic thing you could possibly imagine. And we know that there's a much deeper story going on there. And that's just the nature of the thing. So what did Cayce have to say about Atlantis? Let's get that set up and how we get in here, how we get into the hot zone. Okay, how large was Atlantis during the time of Emilius? And Emilius being the kind of beneficial, sort of the good guys back there, the group that was trying to use the technology for spiritual purposes. So Cayce's answer: comparison that of Europe, including Asia and Europe, not Asia, but Asia in Europe. It's pretty large. This is composed as seen in after the first destruction, that which would be termed now with the present position the southernmost portion of same islands is created by those of the first volcanic or eruptive forces brought into play by the destruction of same. So the island aspect happens. It's originally one large continent, Gulf of Mexico on one side, Mediterranean on the other. And what happens is the kind of basically the war between the Emilius group and the Belial group sets off large-scale volcanic activity, because the technologies that they have through the 2i crystal are attuned too high. So basically like a nuclear blast that sets the islands into three different islands, so that continent is broken up. So imagine the United States having, a major EMP attack coupled with earthquakes and volcanoes, and you'd get like, this whole eastern seaboard piece, the west coast, and then the center, and they'd be three different islands. And he named the three islands Poseidia, Arion, and Og. That's very interesting as well, especially with that Poseidia piece. That's the part that we're after, and in timing, it gets very interesting as well. A little further with Cayce. Was Atlantis at one time one large continent or a group of large islands? And the readings right off the bat are like, why don't you read what we just said? It's three islands. But, and the readings will do that sometimes. There's a little attitude in there. As has been given, what would be considered one large continent until the first eruptions brought these changes from what would now, with the present position of the Earth and its rotation or movements about its sun through space about Arcturus, which he likes to mention, about the Pleiades, be that of a whole or one continent, then with the breaking up producing more and more of the nature of large islands with intervening canals, ravines, gulfs, bays, or stream. And of course, you have the Gulf Stream now and all of those Caribbean islands. So that's what it became. But what was there was a massive continent, and it was gradually broken up. The piece that was advanced and survived the longest was that stretch that's near Bimini, Cuba, and the Yucatan. That's what they call the hot zone now, and that's why there's so many ruins there, that they are telling people who work down there not to say anything about. The problem for us on the surface is in some ways, it's to our credit that we know more about the hot zone than a place like Antarctica, for example. You hear things about Antarctica, and there's no way we're going to really learn anything about it. Unfortunately, I hate to say that, but there's no good whistleblowers from Antarctica. What we have are reports from the original expeditions that got out by accident, and that stuff is powerful and important. And it seems like everything else is really a lot of fantasy. And I believe that there is something very important and large scale going on in Antarctica, but we can't get at it. I mean, actually, we can probably observe, we independent researchers can probably observe space better than we can Antarctica. But what we do have access to is the hot zone. Now, true, there's a lot of risque things going on in the hot zone, like I mentioned, drug running, there's a lot of political intrigue, and there's a lot of rules when you go to dig up things or when you go to explore things. But overall, we have a much better shot of obtaining a snapshot of that history, especially with the idea that the mystery schools gave us of land rising. Land rising has got to be a big theme for us this year, far more important in my mind than wondering what's under Antarctica, because Antarctica can be hidden and the government's going to hide it. But the hot zone's a little bit different. And we have a lot of history on the hot zone. People have already been there before this major shutdown. So what I want to do is I want to take us into the period of Robert Vesco and Richard Nixon and into the 70s. But I want to show that it seemed like at the time the idea of Atlantis and Atlantis rising was going to become part of a massive disclosure. It was already there. It was already happening. One of the major political figures around in that period, he actually became a major driver for the SDI Star Wars program under President Reagan. And he would run independently as a candidate against Reagan and against others. And Lyndon LaRouche, that whole movement of this very strange thing out there. He got sent to prison for mail fraud and things of this nature. But there was a huge movement, a kind of intellectual movement around a different version of history and a number of different interpretations around the deep politics of the time through this character. I want to read something that he put on record, which just to give us an idea that this Atlantis thing, it might be hard for us to get our heads around how these political figures are involved, but back then it wasn't. So that's LaRouche, and certainly a mixed bag with all the things that he tried to bring forward. But I will say there's a lot of cracks that get us into the truth and through the secrecy in the work of LaRouche, while not going along with many of his political positions. And this guy just was a regular thing. If you if you study those presidential elections, there he was showing up as the independent guy over and over again. So this is from LaRouche's newsletters that he would send out during that period. During the Ice Age, around 11,000 BC, the Atlanteans lived in North Africa, where Morocco is today, around the Straits of Gibraltar. Their civilization had the ability to make astronomical observations of an accuracy that would rival those of Kepler in the 17th century AD. The king of this progressive maritime culture was named Uranus. Recall now, 1979, LaRouche had attributed the fall of Atlantis to the melting process at the end of the Ice Age. There's a little bit of truth to that. But by 1982, he and his wife had developed a whole new theory of why Atlantis had collapsed. In their new theory, there arose in Atlantis a faction fight between good Titans versus evil Olympians. It's Belial and Amelia's group. The Titans developed astronomy while the Olympians promoted astrology. So LaRouche claimed during his speeches that in war between the two Atlantean elites and evil usurpers, Olympians, the Atlanteans basically conquered, the evil Olympians conquered the good city-building Titans, and the Olympian conspiracy launched in Atlantis continues to rule the world today. The powerful Olympians are, to the body of human society, is a cancer to the body of a human. This is very interesting. Think of the position of somebody like LaRouche, who runs for president, has a large following for independent candidacy. I mean, he's relatively obscure on the world stage, but also has had a role as one of the SDI Star Wars consultants for Ronald Reagan. Here he is just openly going on about what happened, what took place in Atlantis. And where he's getting this from isn't very clear, but it shows, again, there's knowledge when you get around the hot zone and the players and the deep political aspects. There's a deep knowledge about this, and they had a kind of a liquid, languid way of talking about this in the 70s. It was coming up, and there were documentaries about it, etc. What's interesting is here we are, say maybe about 40 years past that, and it's coming around again, the idea and the aspect. And it's so interesting when we were doing our special on Cayce and Atlantean DNA, which I touch on again tonight. Right after that, there was a Joe Rogan special, and it was Atlantis. I think it was Randall Carlson, and then they had another one, and it was very interesting. Someone pointed out to me the number of different podcasts that were picking up on what seemed like the exact same themes. And, I was just thinking to myself, this is what happens fundamentally. These ideas have the ability to burst through, and, lots of different variations, lots of junk conspiracy, sure. But this is that period, again, that was referred to in anthroposophy as that 100-year window. Here we are again. It's come back around, and we have the ability to move that again through the culture and see if we can open things up. You might recall, some people would say to me that this had happened on some level in the 90s. Well, and what knocked it out after the 90s? Probably 9/11 and the whole fear decade that followed that, with all the orange codes and the bombers, the hidden Middle Eastern bombers and all that kind of stuff. So that is hard. It's hard to get into a spiritual state of mind with all that going on. Of course, the financial coup d'etat follows that, and then the ridiculous Obama administration and all the wars, the Arab Spring, which is basically CIA Spring. So we have to get to understand the position that we're in now. And then with the COVID op and coming up, the UFO threat op, this is the age, it's the period that we're in. But it's been laid out for us that there's something in the interactions of these things that have taken place around the hot zone. That's where there's a major key for us if we can interpret some of the incidents and the personalities and the actions that have taken place, and ask ourselves, why did the mystery schools put it on the map anyway? And why did they say this was going to be a period where that was going to rise and we're going to become aware of the Atlanteans again? There's a reason for it. There's no question. Don't doubt it for a moment. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, deep tonight here in X Series 124. This is the deep state in the hot zone, and we're going to be going into it through the figure of Robert Vesco. Very intriguing guy, very smart high school dropout from Detroit, and criminal mastermind. But he also wanted to mastermind his own version of Atlantis out there in the hot zone. Where was he getting that kind of input from? It makes you wonder, and we're going to explain tonight. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. It's great to be here with everyone, and we're going to be having your questions over with Miss Olivia, which you can ask them now. She's put them together. What do you got?
Want a couple questions?
Sure.
Okay, Darla Cash wants to know, did Cayce specify a location in Yucatan?
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting because a lot of people think it's Guatemala. And because at that time, they called Yucatan, that is that time, 1932, they called Yucatan pretty much that whole area. And eventually, they moved. They identified things as different names. But Cayce talked about an expedition that took back some evidence of these firestones that went to the Pennsylvania State Museum. And a lot of people were confused by this, but tracking it down later, the Pennsylvania State Museum, Pennsylvania University came out with statements saying, we don't have Cayce's Firestone, if that's what you're looking for. This is how intense this thing was. But what he said was he gave descriptions for where the Hall of Records temple was. And he was also explicit that they had put it in a temple that had been destroyed again. So, here we have these fleeing Atlanteans. They deposit everything in these 3 different places, but in one of those places, there's a destruction that causes that Hall of Records to get swallowed up, and they do it again. They basically place it there again. So the research that I've followed in relation to the Yucatan Hall of Records is the piece that is the Guatemalan piece. So that's where I believe it is. All of Yucatan is a great mystery. And I'll tell you, when you get into it, you will find any major figure in history dealing with, aviation, for example. Charles Lindbergh. What did he do in his spare time? Well, he flew over the Yucatan looking at ruins from above. What did Gordon Cooper do? Well, when he was sitting up there in space, he was looking down into the hot zone. What was he doing? He was calculating in his mind different coordinates for things that he was seeing. And the code word over and over again, and you're going to find it tonight too, Spanish galleons, baby. Spanish galleons.
So cool.
But the truth is, it's not Spanish galleons. It is hot zone ruins. Spanish galleons, the code, and that's what every normal treasure hunter is all about. And, it is very interesting stuff. But when we get up at this level, when you're at the level of somebody like Cooper or at the level of Lindbergh, people in these types of elite status around a particular thing, they start to understand what it means. And so when they're talking to somebody, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm looking for a Spanish galleon. But in fact, that's the cover story. What they've seen is temples, pyramids, and in the case of Paulina Zalitsky's report from 2001, where she discovered an entire city, she said it's a metropolis. So we have to come to terms with what that type of discovery, what kind of impact that would have, way before the media has any kind of spin on it. And we've already heard the kind of TTSA, CIA type people being like, maybe the threat is from under the ocean. So I guarantee you, they find some advanced stuff under the ocean. The next thing will be, oh, it's not a UFO threat, it's an Atlantean threat. This is just where they go. What else you got?
Jane Vandervest wanted to know, is the portal for Atlantis the reason why ships disappear in the Bermuda Triangle?
Yeah, there's a magnetic anomaly. There's 2 pieces. I'm actually just about to get into this, but there's 2 pieces to that. One of them is in the period of major destruction in Atlantis, the Two-Eye Stone, which is responsible for powering everything, gets basically set in reverse. So everything that it was meant to do, it implodes. And the effect has such an impact, it actually changed the rotation of the globe. This is the way we get the story from the mystery schools. So it's basically, imagine like the ultimate EMP nuclear thing. And so this thing created a distortion field. I call the distortion field apotheum, which is a name that does appear, if you can find in history, but it's not in a dictionary. I've just found it at different times, and you could say I made it up in a sense, but it is there. You can find it, and but it's APOTHEUM, and that word gets us into a place where we can start to understand what they're talking about when they get into magnetic anomalies or people disappearing into portals or ships disappearing. Apotheum represents just a complete physical reality distortion. So when you get into looking at the UFO file and you hear about things where people walk through walls and all that kind of stuff, that's all apotheum. And all of that type of research, like the Philadelphia experiment, resides inside the UFO file. The X technology, the entire thing resides inside that file. So when we get around to, for example, things dealing with X technology, really advanced thing like Tesla's work, for example, it doesn't have anything to do with UFOs. It just has the same effect. So all that research resides there in the UFO file, and it is the X technology. That's what we're really talking about. So we've developed X technology, and we've seen X technology in the UFO, when we've had UFOs, our government, that is. So, but it doesn't mean that the mystery schools or Tesla and these other people didn't already have it. So it's not just like, hey, we got something from these aliens, crash retrieval, boom, and now we're good to go. No, it's a factor. It's something that we've already been able to, get our hands on through the work. If you look in the 19th century, the work of Keeley, the work of Tesla, they're already touching on it. Tesla told us you could beam wireless energy the same way you do wireless communications. So that's the end of the oil monopoly and all these different types of things. And you have to wonder, really, when they talk about, oh, we're in terrible climate change, and you have John Kerry and all these people running around, either they're totally ignorant of the X technology, or they know about it, but they just love this idea of, giving everyone this big guilt trip. When in fact, let's face it, whenever they talk about cleaning up the environment, which I am totally in favor of, by the way, and I do think there's an environmental problem, but it's the corporations that have made billions of dollars stealing that, selling that stuff to you. And it doesn't have anything to do with the consumer, because these corporations said, you know what, we'll make all this plastic stuff. Devil may care what happens to the environment. We'll make tons of money. We'll make a new civilization on Mars, and you guys can deal with the problems of Earth. They're the ones who should pay for the cleanup, not carbon taxed on people who can't make any money because you've locked them down for 2 years. So let's get real on that. There's a problem when we get around the alternative field. There's a problem. One of the big problems is that it's never an acknowledgement that there's environmental problems. And if you say it, then you're a globalist, greenhouse guy. You're an Al Gore supporter. It's not true. The environment is being destroyed by nuclear tests that we did, by incredible pollution that we've laid out there. Those corporations did it with no thought of, the human race and what was going to happen in the future, just them and their families making tons of money. So those should be the people, look at Apple. They have $40 billion hanging out on their balance sheet. It's just sitting there, right? It's not reinvested anywhere. They have tons of cheap labor in China. I mean, come on.
I said this years ago about McDonald's. Okay. So when you think about, the problem is shareholders, right? Stocks.
It is.
But if they wanted to, as a corporation, if they wanted to green the earth, if they wanted to have organic everything, even organic meat, grass-fed beef, like if they wanted to change agriculture, they had, now not so much, but they had the power to do it, right?
Exactly.
Nobody wants to take a cut. Nobody wants to lose anything.
Right.
It's profit. That's the insanity that we are under.
No, but they do want to take that victory lap in public and say, like, Lloyd Blankfein is saving Patagonia. And Jeff Bezos, he cares about you.
But nobody wants to lose any money.
Exactly.
Or spend any of their own money.
We should call it the Pharisee problem, right? Mm. And this was the thing, which was the Pharisees wanted to be seen as holy and do all this stuff. And it's very clear in the New Testament, basically the thing that Jesus attacks them about is that, they're not using their spirituality for spiritual reasons. They're basically using it to make themselves look good. And the corporations are doing the same thing. They want to look good. Oh, we're cleaning up this country, and you damn irresponsible citizens, you don't live right and all this stuff. Who sold us all this stuff? Who sold us the stuff that wasn't biodegradable, for example? It was you guys, and you made profit on it. Who sold all those people into, seriously needing Medicare and everything else because of cigarettes and the major promotion around smoking? Come on, so they're the ones who made the profits. They're the ones who should clean it up. The alternative community doesn't have to deny or seem like, they're backward, saying, oh, there's no environmental problem. You bet there's an environmental problem. Have you taken a look at the sky lately? There's a big environmental problem, but the environmental problem is not the responsibility of the citizens on the ground. It's the responsibility of the corporations. Actually, it's the responsibility of the citizens on the ground to hold the corporations responsible, and that small group that's made tremendous profits by polluting the earth and basically using us as a scapegoat now to clean it up while they prepare to go to Mars. This is why I don't believe in Captain Musk, everyone. You're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here in episode 124, Deep State in the Hot Zone. And McDonald's, we're going to come back to McDonald's, that's for sure. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program. As I mentioned, right now, I'm going to go into this little bit about Autech. And this is found America's Secret Island and Other Military Bases. Peter Newell is the author. Now, it looks to me like this is a series of articles, but not an actual book. It is loaded with such interesting information. If you want to get around to Vesco and Autek, we're taking the right route. All right. Secret Island or Island Secrets. I'm going to give you the breakaway on this, the bottom line on this, and then read it. What happens is the FBI has Robert Vesco on this island bribing all these Bahamian officials, and he is living the life of Riley. He has a presidential plane, a 707 that he keeps himself, and he has parties on it. He built a disco into this thing and a sauna, and he's living the life of Riley. But what happened, which is very interesting to me, is when you look at what the FBI had him dead to rights. They said, we have him on all these bribes, and who stops them but the CIA? And the CIA says, no, we don't want you to take Vesco. And the FBI goes back and says, well, we thought you wanted to get Vesco. What's going on here? And they say, no, because the guy that he's hooked up with, who's the president of the Bahamas, he's the one who controls access to Andros Island, and we might lose Autek. So Autek, again, being the Underwater 51. They didn't want to lose that strategic position by ticking off the president of the Bahamas. And we're going to get into some of these Bahamas characters because some of them have a long track record with Bimini, and their presence there is unusual. And the people they invite down there, like Martin Luther King and Richard Nixon and Harry Truman, you got to wonder, what are these people doing on Bimini, this tiny island? Well, we're going to get some answers here. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the CIA do not always see eye to eye. Often there's been a conflict between the domestic agency and the so-called overseas organization. Yeah, the CIA used to be an overseas organization. Now they interfere domestically all the time. As previously noted, in 1987, the CIA acted against Lyndon Pindling. Okay, Lyndon Pindling is the president of the Bahamas in that period. This guy's going to come up over and over again because he's very tight and provides cover for Vesco. Robert Vesco, who is the disgraced American financier who's very close to Nixon, who basically takes off with all of this money from these mutual funds that these servicemen have paid into, and he goes and takes his $250 million into the Bahamas with him, which is worth maybe about $2 billion nowadays. As previously noted, in 1987, the CIA acted against Lyndon Pindling, partly because Pindling had granted sanctuary to the financier Robert Vesco, wanted by the FBI. In September 1983, according to Time magazine, a dispute developed between a proposed covert FBI operation and the CIA. Since 1972, the FBI has been investigating the activities of Vesco and Bahamian officials allegedly involved in illegal drug smuggling into the U.S. Now, we have to remember, when you get into that Reagan era, it is nonstop drug smuggling. That's where shows like Miami Vice and all the whole culture of cocaine and crack and all that stuff. It's the CIA and moving all of that, the drugs from South America directly into America using these intermediaries. The characters you see caught up in that, former President Bill Clinton, Mena, Arkansas was used as the major drop point for all that. So, and George H.W. Bush running all the operations, and his son greasing the wheels for his son to become president. The CIA station chief in Nassau successfully opposed the FBI operation, the sting operation, which was to catch the officials that were getting bribes from Vesco. They could get two birds with one stone. But the CIA station chief in Nassau successfully opposed the FBI operation on the grounds that it would jeopardize the continued use by the United States of Autek and other activities on Andros, including presumably the global submarine surveillance system. Autek at Andros in the Bahamas includes one of the largest sea bottom arrays in U.S. global submarine surveillance. What were the Americans hiding on Andros? Why the secrecy? Why was the CIA so concerned? It was another Area 51. So they're building something in Autek which gives them the mastery of the entire hot zone. So yes, they can see any submarine, but that's not what AUTEC is for. They do have British forces that train in AUTEC. There's a NATO presence there in Andros Island, that island that's just hanging out in the Bahamas. You've got, the British major hardcore troops. You've got NATO. I mean, it's pretty amazing what's happening there. And you don't really think about those Bahama islands like that at all. Paul Albury, in his Story of the Bahamas, mentions that to the east of Andros, there's a great submarine canyon called the Tongue of the Ocean, which was selected by the United States as an ideal site for testing underwater weapons and protective devices. So when you're getting around this, you're starting to get the idea, okay, they have a traditional reason, which is we have to be able to master underseas, and this is a great place for us to test out weapons and things. But what's it actually for? This is where you get into testing the ability for the X technology at that level. You can't really, you can't be found out because you're AUTEC, you're kind of the authority out there. Who's going to question you? The Coast Guard? It's not going to happen. So you are your own independent autonomous authority. You can do anything. So what happens is the entire area and all of the NDAs and things get subject to this hot zone thing. All the people are working down there, and they say, if you see things, you can tell us, but you can't tell anyone else. So that is subject through AUTEC and through various government agencies in the military, in the Navy. If you're down there and you see, as I said, like the Pyramid of Isis, the Temple of Isis, tough luck, because you're not going to be able to say anything to the press. But it's important that with their sonar and the way that they read sonar to create images, they now have a great picture of what's under there. So let's say, we'll grant them the traditional reasons, the defense installations and things of this nature, the military installations. Fine. But what can it actually be used for if there's large-scale ruins under there? And if they're very clued in on this idea of Atlantis and the Two-Eye Stone, etc., then they basically have the run of the place by doing sound imaging. Let's go a little further. In an article, Secret Island Spy Base, 110 miles from Florida, published in the Portland Free Press, Gene Wheaton asserts that the most closely guarded secret on the U.S. covert operators is located on Andros Island in the Bahamas, the top covert secret. So this is the most secret installation, and is controlled by the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office. That's the office that controls our satellites. You'd think it'd be controlled by the Navy. It's not. The NRO controls it. That's a very big piece that's been kind of left hanging out there. And then we have a major CIA agent who, Theodore Shackley, who's covered extensively in Peter Dale Scott's work. And this will get us into Vesco. Theodore Shackley is the kind of guy who shows up in places like the Philippines and suddenly the government's overthrown. And he had such an extensive history and so much power that the government was afraid to fire him outright because of all his connections and all the things he could go public with. So if you look at the work of Professor Scott, you're going to find Shackley involved in just about every major CIA operation through the 60s and 80s. Now, what's interesting is this article asserts that the secret facility, AUTEC, was central to Theodore Shackley's third option, the project to create domestic unrest, chaos, and the illusion of a domestic terrorist threat. Sound familiar? Within America. According to the Portland Free Press, the operation was controlled by the same group of CIA covert operators who were running the Jupiter, Florida-based Continental Shelf Associates and the New Orleans-based Pacific Gulf Marines, the same lunatic fringe of the intelligence community who were investigated by the Pike and Church congressional committees in the mid-'70s, the same faction behind the Kennedy assassination, etc. So what you have there, I'll break all that down. Basically, Shackley was one of the people who thought this group that was inside the intelligence agencies and the people that they represented, because remember, the Central Intelligence Agency is a body that it represents Wall Street and basically came out of a Wall Street law firm, S&C. So that's where Dulles and all those people came from. So what they represent is international finance that runs out of Manhattan. That's how the CIA got embedded in the government. And that's why people like Truman and all the rest opposed it, even though he eventually got dogged into setting it up. And this has been the big push-pull, because the international connections of international finance into America through New York is how we get into these problems, and how you have independent armies being built up, and how during something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, the CIA sent people into Cuba to take out Castro without any orders from Kennedy, and how that almost became a nuclear incident. So all of these things give us that foundation. But AUTEC being linked in with Shackley, that's something that gives us extra pause when we think about what AUTEC is. And again, it's the Underwater Area 51, but now we have to wonder about its impact. Now, there's a program to Shackley who said, this third option is we can use these types of facilities to create domestic unrest and create domestic terrorists. That was the original idea for if you had unrests in the United States. For example, they had anti-war riots and things like that. And these groups were very determined to create government functions that would repress those things from ever happening again. So they didn't want to be told, hey, get out of Vietnam or whatever it was back in their day. And then when they were going into the 80s and trying to start wars in Nicaragua and other places, they were encountering this movement again. You don't see many anti-war movements now, do you? Very interesting as we look at this history. But remember, the continuity of government also has that as a clause there, that the first thing that they do is when they seize power as an emergency arm of the government, they lock down all of the dissident groups. So COG, AUTEC, these are the anti-constitutional, extra-governmental forces that are just hanging out there. And AUTEC now, we find, has this link with Shackley. That's going to give us what we need when we're going in to look at Vesco. Now, let's look at one other piece on this, something that he said, which might, again, the same article, it was Peter Newell, it might give us a hint. And what's funny is he's quoting an article by something that's in something called X Factor magazine, which I think is hilarious. All right, during the 1970s, oceanographers puzzled over strange sonar readings from hydrophones, which suggested a second Atlantic seabed below the first one. All right, that's oceanographers in the 1970s. They're looking at the regular seabed that everyone else is dealing with, and then through their own sound experiments, there's another seabed, which means one is sitting on top of the other. This gets us into understanding why people look at that and say, well, the ocean, it's doing this and it's doing that. You're looking at one seabed, but the other one, which you're not told about, you can't say anything about it because, they don't know anything about it. But somebody on the inside knows about it. That's why you get, just like a secondary space program, we know certain things happen with one space program, the public space program, NASA, and then there's a secret space program. Well, you understand there's one group that understands what the Atlantic is normally, and then there's a second Atlantic floor bed, totally different. So it suggests a second Atlantic seabed under the first one. Test drillings, however, revealed evidence of abundance of methane hydrate. Aircraft were also said to be affected. Nigel Cathorn, writing in the X Factor magazine, quote, to this day, craft continue to be missing in the general area of the Bermuda Triangle, but this is inevitable when human error is given the opportunity to combine with equipment failure. The idea that the area is home to some sort of mysterious dark forest which swallows up aircraft and ships alike provides a great story, but it appears the facts are far less sinister. Mysterious plane crashes and vanishings also continue to occur south of Puerto Rico and the Bermuda Triangle between the Caribbean, Las Rocas, and the north coast of Venezuela, known as Las Rocas Curse. There have been more than 15 incidents between the mid-1990s and 2013. In January 2013, a plane carrying 6 passengers, including the Italian fashion executive Vittorio Missoni, I don't know that one, disappeared on a flight to Caracas. No wreckage has been located. This is interesting because this guy's concluded that basically there's a natural phenomena here that's operative, and it has to do with the second floor bed. So again, we're looking at secrets that don't make it into the traditional way when we look at it, and people talk about, well, there's the ocean floors, there's blue holes here, we're exploring this, we're exploring that. But these groups, the AUTECs of the world, with their type of advanced sonar exploration of that undersea world, they know that there's a totally different secondary Atlantic floor bed. All right. That means that the facts that they're dealing with go into an area that for their consideration. So what we can imagine is that a group like AUTEC discovered this magnetic anomaly there operative deep in the hot zone, and that it has something to do with the ruins that are down there. So the incredible investment of geopolitical intrigue and energy underwater is about a lot more than just positioning for resources, for example. There's something about that anomaly that the governments and the scientists on the most secret level in those governments are aware of. And it relates somehow to the ancient ruins that are off the coast of Cuba and off the coast of Bimini in that hot zone area. So now that we're on the same level with them and thinking about this, now let's start to look at somebody like our friend Vesco and what he's doing down there. There's lots of opportunities for running drugs. Why is Castro so kind to this guy? Why do other countries like Costa Rica defend him endlessly? Yes, he has a lot of money. Yes, he has a lot of connections. But still, it does seem interesting that what he's trying to do is set up what? An independent micronation down there, just like Lester Hemingway's New Atlantis. And he's calling his Aragon. Let's take a little look at Vesco and what the traditional story is around him, and then provide a little bit of insight of what he may really be doing down there. We're going to do this in reverse because in the 60s, you know, he has that incredible rise. He takes over this corporation, and then he bilks the corporation and takes off after giving Nixon a lot of money and mentoring Nixon's nephew, Don Jr. But in the middle of all this, in 1996, Vesco is grabbed, and he's grabbed with Don Nixon by Cuban authorities and put in jail after living there basically for 18 years. Everything's hunky-dory. In 1995, this is an article out of NBC. In 1995, I went to Havana to try to interview Vesco in jail. I failed, but BBC. But I found his partner in the pharmaceutical enterprise, Donald M. Nixon, widely known as Don, who happened to be a nephew of former U.S. President Richard Nixon, proudly showing me a custom-made Havana cigar in the shape of a large penis. Don told me, quote, "Bob Vesco is the most brilliant man I've ever met." Speaking of the drug TX, which got Vesco jailed, remember that TX? Mr. Nixon insisted it would have been the biggest story ever, the biggest breakthrough in the history of man, changing the total social economic structure of the world. Pretty interesting. Think of the language here. The biggest story ever. What's the biggest story ever? The biggest breakthrough in the history of man, changing the total social economic structure of the world. Well, let's get into TX for a minute. We have a couple of different references to it. TX, it so happens, is the thing that takes Vesco down. And what happens, the shorthand of the whole thing is that Vesco, with Nixon, gets into this idea that citronella provides the basis for an AIDS drug. This is in the early 90s. And that it has such incredible properties for the immune system that it's going to eliminate the entire issue. And so what happens is Vesco funnels all this money to Don Nixon, Nixon's nephew, And Don Nixon takes in all these bio facilities and creates a biolab in Cuba. And the biolab with the scientists in Cuba are supposed to develop this drug based on citronella. I know you're more of the herbalist than I am. Do you want to say anything about citronella?
No.
But basically, it's something.
The only thing I know that it's used for, it's, natural insect repellent, right? Specifically mosquitoes. It has kind of a lemony scent.
Interesting. And would you say it's free and available wherever you go?
It's cheap.
It's cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they develop this drug using this system in Cuba, and they're going to market it as TX in 1996. And what happens is they get grabbed, and finally, after years and years of the U.S. being after them, Vesco is put in jail in Cuba, but nonetheless goes to jail finally. And then 13 years later, supposedly dies, but then it's found out that he fakes his own death, etc.
Is that proven? That's just a theory.
I'm going to prove it out, but he wasn't in the grave. So, and Vesco was 7 years old at the time. It's very plausible with all that kind of money that he wanted to escape, and that they gave him basically the green door to do it. Okay. Here's the basis of the story. Nixon nephew in U.S. after Cuba ordeal. President Nixon's nephew was back home Thursday after being detained in Cuba for a month while authorities questioned him about his ties to fugitive financier Robert Vesco. Donald Nixon Jr. returned late Tuesday and spent Wednesday morning with FBI agents who questioned him about Vesco, who fled the U.S. in 1971 to avoid charges that he stole $224 million from mutual fund investors. In an interview Thursday on ABC's Good Morning America, Nixon denied a published report that he works for Vesco. In fact, he worked for him and lived with him for 14 years, but technically wasn't working for him at this point. He maintained that Vesco simply was interfacing with the Cuban government on behalf of a pharmaceutical test that Nixon hopes will lead to a better treatment of breast cancer of his wife, Helene. Nixon described his interrogation by Cubans as rough and scary, but mentioned no specific mistreatment. U.S. officials want Cuba to surrender Vesco, who was also under indictment for allegedly trying to buy his way back into the country with a $200,000 contribution to Richard Nixon's 1972 presidential campaign. Now, this is 1995 when this is happening, okay? So they're going back 23 years, anything that they can do to get their hands on this guy. After bouncing around several countries, Vesco settled in Cuba in 1982. In 1989, he was indicted on drug conspiracy charges in Jacksonville, Florida. Nixon said he arrived in Cuba 4 months ago through Vesco's tie with the Cuban government, got officials interested in manufacturing an AIDS and cancer drug aimed at boosting the human immune system. Nixon said he was at Vesco's home May 31st when Cuban officials took Vesco away and arrested him on suspicions of being a foreign agent. This is interesting. Think about Vesco, who's American. He's from Detroit, high school dropout, became an incredible millionaire, and built his company and then took off to the Bahamas, but then became basically a phenomena down there, drug running and basically propping up these different governments and trying to make a micronation that he would rule, a la New Atlantis. But here he is. He's established this bond with Castro, who never gave him up under any circumstances. He's there 18 years. But something about this strange AIDS drug and the biolab that they create there right in Cuba, this raises all kinds of interesting possibilities. It could even have been the fact that Don Nixon was involved with it, because after all, Don Nixon's uncle was President Nixon, and President Nixon had tried on a number of occasions to eliminate Fidel Castro. But there's some piece there that makes Castro act completely differently. Let's keep going. I swear, I didn't think they were going to let me go, he said. The FBI, Nixon said, just wanted to know about Cuba, about Vesco. The drug that Nixon is promoting is called TX. He says it has no toxic side effects and is derived from the extract of the citronella plant. He said it would take up to 10 years and cost too much to get TX approved for use in this country. So this gets us into very interesting territory because, one, what were they really developing? Two, why was the boot so hard and heavy? After all, Vesco had been hanging out there for almost 20 years. Why did this make it happen? Then later, Nixon's nephew probed about links to Vesco. A nephew of the late president said he watched fugitive financier be arrested by Cuban authorities. Don Nixon is now under house arrest in Cuba, trying to get back his passport. So they grab Vesco, and there he is. I'm going to show him in his kind of more glory Miami Vice style days. There's Vesco, who created a mutual fund empire, used shell corporations, including Cryogenics Inc., and basically changed the political landscape with his contributions and became ultra close to the Nixon administration. The Nixon administration ultimately very close to the Howard Hughes aerospace group and Howard Hughes and his mega sprawling organization. So when we're looking at Vesco, we're looking at somebody who's deep on the drug part, deep in the political aspect, that close to the political leadership, but then also has this incredible criminal finance background. And so he goes off and he's creating these strange little subsets off in the Bahamas, these businesses that come up and disappear. By the way, that 707 of his disappeared when before he died. So no one knows where that 707 went. It's kind of hard to hide a plane that big. Robert Vesco, the American financier, fled the U.S. in 1972 when wanted on charges of looting $224 million from a Swiss-backed mutual stock fund. He was later accused of plotting to pay a kickback to Billy Carter, brother of then-President Jimmy Carter, in a Libyan arms deal. Vesco surfaced with family in Cuba in 1982, living on a boat outside Key Largo. In 1996, Cuba sentenced him to 13 years in prison for illegally marketing a drug he claimed would cure cancer and AIDS. Why on earth does Castro care if he was marketing a drug for AIDS? Think about it. He'd kept him there. There are so many heavy-duty charges against this guy. This guy had been running drugs over his island. Why on earth does it take him with this TX drug and the development of that biolab and all the biolab equipment coming into Cuba with Don Nixon? His business partner, Don Nixon Jr., nephew of late President Nixon, was detained along with Vesco but released. Vesco is believed to have served most of that sentence. Cuban records indicate he died of lung cancer November 23rd, 2007, age 71. So all these reports come out later that he wasn't in the grave. The grave had a different name. And also the CIA agent who was rogue that I mentioned earlier, who we're going to get into now, who joined him as a partner while he was there in Cuba and was going to be part of this whole pharmaceutical wonder. This guy, Frank Turple, he said, oh no, he faked his death and he went to Sierra Leone, which is in West Africa. Now, what's interesting about that is Sierra Leone is often touted as the place that Jim Morrison disappeared to when he said that Jim Morrison faked his death. The only reason I even think about that in relation to this is the circumstances around Jim Morrison's death are so unusual, and including the fact that it was a closed casket, none of the band members were invited, and just a number of things which give you the impression that if somebody did fake their death on the rock and roll side, it wasn't Elvis, but Jim, on the other hand. Most peculiar, indeed. At least we know that the official story around his death is completely faulty for a lot of reasons. Because, as he's supposed to be dying there in his apartment, people seeing him hanging out at a nightclub, and there's a lot of inconsistencies, including the fact that Marianne Faithfull's boyfriend was a drug dealer at the time. And she was like, oh, he was partying with Morrison on that night he died. he fled the country the next day. So there's something unusual in that story. But again, was that Sierra Leone? He disappeared. I guess this is just change your identity, shred your identity. Okay, Frank Turple, accused of supplying explosives and training to international terrorists and described by some as the most dangerous man in the world. Ex-CIA agent Turple appears before and after his flight from justice. His astonishing personal saga is told in a 90-minute special, Frank Turple, Confessions of a Dangerous Man. And there was a big thing about him in 1982. He defected supposedly from the CIA and was helping these foreign nations like Libya and like Cuba learn all these different techniques about explosives and intelligence and all the rest. But Turple became Vesco's partner in Cuba. So by the time you get to them marketing a drug for AIDS, you've got Turple, ex-CIA, Vesco, criminal financier fleeing from the United States, and Don Nixon, the nephew of President Nixon, and also the son of Donald Nixon, who is the same Don Nixon that Howard Hughes gave all that money to so he could start this fast food chain of restaurants in California. So you have all those things so tightly wound. And, if you get even close to thinking about Howard Hughes around this time, there's the whole thing about him fleeing after he got charged in Las Vegas. And he goes where? He goes to the Bahamas. And where does he live? Well, he lives at the Atlantis resort. So we're already getting into this kind of territory just on the periphery around Vesco. And what you get, if you go in a little bit deeper, is he has something. He has access to something. And a lot of people have wondered over the years, there have been a lot of conjecture about Vesco and what he had access to that gave him such carte blanche when he was down there in the hot zone. Interestingly enough, that theme got picked up by an NBC show called
Blacklist.
The Blacklist. And the person who plays him is Stacy Keach. And what they do is a little bit different from the rest of the scripts, where they have a bunch of fictional characters. They use Vesco's actual name. This is the actual character of Robert Vesco. And I'm going to take a quick look at the show here. Very kind of, it's got a noir twist to it. Mm-hmm. You like that poster?
Yeah, it looks cool.
It is very interesting. All right. In their show, the main character is played by James Spader from Stargate and Stargate Atlantis. And by the way, in his career, our friend Stacy Keach, who plays Vesco, also played Hemingway in the Hemingway movie. And interestingly enough, he not only played Hemingway, who else did he play?
I don't know. Who?
President Nixon. That, again, is Keach as Nixon. So it's funny because he plays all three of the figures in this episode for the Hot Zone.
That's wild.
He played Nixon, he played Hemingway, he played Vesco. So what's he doing in Blacklist? Well, oddly enough, all the rumors that swirled in reality around Vesco have come home to roost in this show, which has run now for 8 years. And he showed up just a couple of times in these special episodes. But what I want to make clear about Vesco, and what's so interesting to me, is that there are these rumors, just like there were rumors about Gordon Cooper and something that he was looking for down in the hot zone. And there's a show on called Cooper's Treasures, which is all about this guy who supposedly shared space with him, diving these wrecks with a notebook he left behind and all the rest. Well, that's going to dovetail nicely with what I have to tell you tonight. But there is this idea that whenever people get down there, that they know something or they've got access to something. In Vesco's case, it was never clear, but there was an idea that he was searching for, get ready for it, Spanish galleons. Mm-hmm. And so what they have in the series is him taking these Spanish galleons, gold, and faking his own death. But along the way, he falls in with a religious extremist group that is looking for sacred objects. And so that's one of the scenes for it. And you can see on the screen one of those very unusual objects. I mean, really take a look at that thing, and it makes you wonder about the kind of imagery from that show that they have on this, which is really interesting. It's got a distinctly kind of Atlantean look to it. And so Vesco in the series, he basically gets all this gold from this shipwreck, and he finds out that it's hidden in an opera house in New Orleans, and they go on this whole thing. And it turns out that in the show, he is the former mentor for Red, who's the main character, the James Spader character. So we're getting into like a real interesting echo of Vesco there, and Vesco's activities in the hot zone, what they really may have been about, and also that it's an open secret, basically, that Vesco faked his death, and that whoever showed up there at the funeral was, you know, they just had a body in a casket. So very easy for them to do, and also a little bit explains, if you think about Castro himself, you know, there's something really strange with the idea that he would just put Vesco after protecting him from 20 years in prison. So we have an echo here that whatever Don Nixon was getting into him with on this AIDS drug in the 90s, we don't know if, one, they found something miraculous, or if maybe everything that they were doing was a cover for this hot zone style activity, and the AIDS drug was just kind of a good cover story for him to be down there. Because after all, Nixon knew all about the hot zone. And those connections that Vesco was still completely active right there in the center of Cuba brings us back to that initial piece, which is, who was it who was down there, who was doing these kind of covert operations originally? That brings us back to the original story of Ernest Hemingway in the hot zone. And interestingly enough, it's going to dovetail in a very fascinating way. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're deep, deep in the hot zone now, looking at the Atlantis Rising theme through the figure of Robert Vesco. We're going to be getting to your questions very shortly here in about 20 minutes, 15 minutes. And I'm going to try to rush through the rest of this.
Can I throw something out there?
Yeah.
This is very interesting. So we have someone in the Ideas Room named Tina Boric. And she says citronella is right up there with artemisia, otherwise known as wormwood. This kills, yes, kills 21 different types of cancer. I grow it. National Institute of Health, artemisia kills 25 different types. Look it up. I was an oncology nurse for years, always researching medical treatments, been nurse for 34 years and a CCM for 22.
Wow. That's really interesting, because the rumors that I read about was that the Clinton administration said to Don Nixon, we'll leave you alone if you just shut up about TX. So whatever TX, there was a holistic doctor who was working around this citronella formula, and he had treated some people with AIDS and supposedly was getting great results. And what happens is he goes into court and they prosecute him and all the rest and say, oh, you know, like, you're going to lose your medical license for doing this. And he has to apologize and say, oh, you know, it was irresponsible of me to do this. He's the doctor that's working with them on this. So there's a whole background around this drug. And I'm going to give you the actual name of the TX drug as we get along here. But yeah, really fascinating. Is that what you had? Did you want more?
That's what I had.
That's pretty good. I want to go to Bimini for a moment. I really want to go to Bimini. Okay, here we go. We're going to Bimini. Check this out. Did you know that Islands in the Stream, which is this incredibly popular Ernest Hemingway novel released posthumously, was originally called Bimini? Actually, he left it called Bimini, and the publishers decided, oh, let's call it Island in the Stream. The Old Man and the Sea was initially planned as the 5th of the Land, Sea, and Air book. As Hemingway referred to the longest of his manuscripts he worked on the last decade of his life, the first book, Bimini, would later be posthumously published as the first part of Islands in the Stream. Okay, so he's writing a book and he's calling it Bimini. We know that he lived there starting in 1935. We know that the Cayce readings on Bimini happened in 1928 originally, and then he does them through the 30s and early 40s. We also know that his brother Lester goes to Bimini 5 years before that, 1930. So he's got the real inside track. Lester goes there first. And eventually Lester would move there as well. He also would do these television specials in the late 70s and early 80s about finding this Atlantean healing well in Bimini. And they're very interesting, and they're shot with his daughter Hilary Hemingway, who's the cousin of Mariel and Margot Hemingway. And she writes books about alien abduction. Mm-hmm. And have and characters like Colonel Andros and I mean, getting very interesting. All right, here's the deal. Take a good look at these two. That's Hemingway with Castro. Castro said Hemingway's books inspired him to do the revolution. But supposedly Hemingway was no fan of that revolution. Hemingway had developed his own intelligence network, and our people here on the CIA side were very unhappy about that. But there was something else that he was working on. And we've gone through a series of episodes exploring his investigations of the ocean floor at the time, including a very scientific ship that he rode around in. And they said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm looking for German U-boats." But of course, he had no arms. And so if you found a German U-boat, they'd just blast him out of the water, and that would be that. So that never made sense. And all that scientific equipment, cameras, and all the rest of it. This guy was compiling footage of the hot zone and what's underneath. And that's where you get his brother founding New Atlantis, etc. If you know the X series, you've got the full tilt on that. But this relationship is going to become very important because what happens is over time, there's a thought that, okay, he's kept something. Hemingway had a secret down there and he's kept it in Cuba. And so there became this whole push by the Kennedy administration that they knew what he had down there and they wanted it back. And Hemingway himself had a villa down there, Finca Vigia, mm-hmm. and he had a vault and all these works there, and that vault eventually had to be smuggled. The contents of that vault had to be smuggled on a shrimp boat.
Wait, isn't it Finca Vieja or something like that?
Oh, Vieja, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, Finca Vieja. And what happens is the whole story starts to unravel a little bit because Mary Hemingway is hell-bent on getting those materials to Jackie Kennedy, who can then store them at the future Kennedy Library, which is, as you know, the largest repository of any information regarding Ernest Hemingway. They have the largest collection. Anything that relates to Hemingway, they've got it. It's not some Ernest Hemingway museum somewhere. It's the JFK Library here in Boston. So that, there's a lot of interesting pieces around that. But let's just say this occurred as the result of something of Kennedy going into Cuba and a national security document coming out in 2015 that said he was discussing with Ed Lansdale, Robert Kennedy, who was the attorney general at the time and the head of the CIA, how to create this national security action that would risk a international incident that would take place at Hemingway's villa there in Cuba after Hemingway had left. The only conclusion could be whatever it was about going in there and getting something and taking it out. Now, no one's going to risk that kind of stuff just to get interesting notes and poems and things from Hemingway. Something else was there. This is the crux of the story. And by the way, the information that Hemingway left there is still guarded heavily by the Cubans. And once in a while, when people go to show up, they schedule these times when people can look at a little bit of it. They'll show up and it's under very tight conditions, and then they ship them out. And I've seen those press conferences. They seem to be acting like, they've got, nuclear materials or something. I mean, everybody is really, there's barely any access to any of it. Now, the original cover for Islands in the Stream had X-steganography in the form of two trees that were crossed. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see that, but I think, can you see that X there? I found that just interesting because of all the things that we've gone through on the Hemingway front and all the connections. There were the Bimini piece, the name of the book being Bimini, and the strong resonance of how Hemingway learned how to write and code. Here's a good example. So his mother is Grace Hemingway Hall, and she's there with her husband, who would eventually commit suicide under strange circumstances. But Grace Hall Hemingway became very close to, you guessed it, the Sleeping Prophet, Edgar Cayce, and got readings for herself and Ernest. But one of the people who came from Michigan, and they were living in Michigan at the time, she moved to Illinois, and Casey's sons would go and visit her. There's one letter I was reading where they were staying there for a month. That's pretty close when you're hanging out with somebody for a month. So there's a character in Bimini, Islands in the Stream, named Thomas Hudson. And interestingly enough, Grace Hall Hemingway, in her looking for psychic information, runs across Thomas J. Hudson, who wrote The Law of Psychic Phenomena there and who also was in Michigan. And those books would become a big influence on her. And then somehow in that transposition of him observing, Ernest observing Grace, and they didn't have such a great relationship, but the crisscross of that name Hudson, the inventor of the law of psychic phenomena, as the star of the Bimini novel, it just sits out there, in this way and shows Hemingway's ability to cross-reference code. That's, shall we say. Now, one of the things that we know in relation to Kennedy is that there are letters on record that he sent to Hemingway, but officially on the record, it's not known whether he had a relationship of any kind with him. But it's fascinating because left there at his dorm at Harvard is a full letter to Ernest Hemingway, sounding like, talking about the war and challenges to young people and all this stuff, sounding like the way you would talk to somebody who was kind of like a friend, but maybe somebody who was a mentor even. And the letter it's unsent, or whatever it happens to be, or it might have been a draft. Whatever it was, it indicates that there's a very early crisscross with John F. Kennedy and Hemingway. And this may have come through the fact that Gertrude Stein had come through Harvard and that JFK had met her, and that she became this incredible influence on Hemingway when he was at Paris. That may be the link. And I also want to suggest, as we've talked about in this show, that link could include what they call the Caroline Group in the Thomas Townsend Brown work, where he, in Cuba in the early 1930s, was recruited into this group doing very secret technological work off Cuba and these incredible yachts. And he's there to test deep sea submersibles in 1930. He's there during a major earthquake when he shows up. Thomas Townsend Brown, who became a deep black scientist for the US before he was like, aha, I see what you're going to use this for. And he goes off and kind of does his own experiments. But that early intelligence unit before the Central Intelligence Agency seems to have overlaps with Thomas Townsend Brown, Hemingway, and JFK. They all seem to be around that. And it is concerning this thing, this secret, whatever it happens to be, there in Cuba. So what we have, and this is going to kind of bring us into the Hemingway piece, is a book that comes out from someone who was in the military during the during the Kennedy era, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this guy wrote astonishing novels. His name is Bill Granger, and all of his novels were about the November Man. It's all this inside CIA stuff, and everyone wants to know, how does this guy know so many things? Like, obviously his background in the military gives him that edge, but he seems to know a great deal. In his series, Miami, November Man, which has this guy going to Miami and all these other places, seems to show that deep intelligence knowledge. Well, Granger wrote a book which is very fascinating called Hemingway's Notebook. And in it, the whole quest that's going on in the CIA is to find out Hemingway's notebook, which this main character, Colonel Reddy, has access to. And they're trying to find out what was going on there. And basically, there's the suggestion that JFK set up a unit called R Section, R, the letter R, Section, which spied on the CIA. So it watched the watchers after the Bay of Pigs. And this is very interesting because when we have heard in relation to JFK that there's so many things, like Judge Napolitano talking about Trump saying there were things in those records that you wouldn't believe, and that's why the CIA couldn't release them. And this big push-pull around these records that the CIA has, which the CIA would never put anything important on record anyway. But somehow there's something in those records that they don't want to come out. And Trump saying to Judge Napolitano, Andrew, if you knew it was in there, you couldn't let them out either. So this idea that our section is this group that is watching the CIA is very interesting and true. Hemingway's Notebook is a novel, but this guy and his depth of experience in the military and from working with intelligence professionals gives us a very interesting look at what may be part of this hot zone secret in relation to Hemingway. I'm going to read just a couple of passages from this before we go to that. What do you got?
Oh, I got a great question for you.
Yeah.
Start it. David Tormino wanted to know, DJ, wasn't Ted Shackley also tied into the Pine Gap controversy?
He went over there, yes. And so Shackley we can plug in with drug running, advanced technology, and overthrow of governments. And that's just for starters. But Shackley is heavily featured in American Deep State by Peter Dale Scott, and also in American War Machine. So he gets special mention. And what's interesting is they couldn't fire him. And so what Jimmy Carter decides to do with him is says, well, I don't have any work for you. So, I'm not going to fire you, but I'm just not going to give you any work. Okay, so the goal around this book is that Hemingway's Notebook is out there. The CIA wants it. And this Colonel Reddy, who has the real story and who became close to Hemingway and figured out Hemingway was on a mission when he was down in Cuba, he starts to talk to this other guy about what happened and what it is, what's in the notebook. So I'm going to read a couple of passages, but I recommend the book. So he says, I never told him directly, even when he got more brutal in the last couple of years. The notebook was proof, you might say. I was a witness of the truth, but who was going to believe an ex-spook who might really still be a spook? By the way, I think that this is the author speaking through the character, interestingly enough. I was just another guy with a story to sell to Penthouse Magazine or something, and it wasn't worth telling if I couldn't back it up. This is interesting because at that time, that's what would happen. These incredible stories would show up in Playboy or Penthouse, and they were some of the most deep, exposés, whistleblowing, and all the rest of it. They would show up in those men's magazines, and they were competitive with each other about the political content that they had. Oddly enough, strange format. I told him I had this wonderful notebook from Hemingway that told all about many wonderful things. To know all these things was to have power. Okay, many wonderful things. To know these things was to have power. Remember Don Nixon's quote earlier was like, this would change the world, you know. So it seems to me they're getting at this deeper hot zone secret. That's really what we're talking about, because you know, straight up, they could be referring to straight up intelligence secrets, but the language is almost religious. So the guy asks him, what about Hemingway? And he says, you saw the effing book. Yes. Code. It was a code. I taught him a code. And he says that he uses the code in the Bimini book. Tell me about Hemingway. No. But let me tell you about the good colonel. He dealt with anyone who wanted to play cards with him, an equal opportunity whore, a soldier of fortune. And so they go, there's this kind of back and forth as they go further along. Now I'm going to cut to an interesting little piece. And basically what it suggests is that Eisenhower placed informants in Cuba to get messages to Hemingway to negotiate with Castro because he didn't want to send in an invasion force to take him out when he first took the island. That's part of this code thing. But what I think they're referring to with the code is related to the hot zone. Here we go. Colonel Reddy wanted to finish off the CIA once and for all. The character in the book, Colonel Reddy, is he's someone who's done intelligence work and is disillusioned with how brutal the organization is. Reddy wanted to finish off the CIA once and for all. He also wanted to use you, make you a scapegoat. Harry Francis, this other character. He wanted to make you a scapegoat. Tie a can to your tail. When the invasion failed, CIA would be after your ass as well as Reddy's. Pardon my language. You were the R section man come back to life. R section was set up by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs invasion because Kennedy had known that CIA had betrayed him. A rival intelligence agency to check on the CIA, a spy to spy upon the spies. This is really interesting. Our section gets into the X-Protect versus X-Reveal X-Share group, and it has a lot of overlap there. Just a couple of quick things left in here. So they had this program, it was called St. Michael. If it worked, it would work against Cuba. The money would come for it. CIA would get a green light. Hemingway's notebook was proof it had once been done. Hemingway named me in the book, told how he had been used by me in the notebook, told about the secret negotiations between Castro and President Eisenhower in 1960 to set up normal relations. Langley sabotaged these talks. Hemingway knew about it, hated it, was afraid of it, of what it was going to happen to him on the farm in Cuba. He loved Cuba. He loved the United States. So this is supposedly an excerpt from the Hemingway notebook. Quote, Harry Francis liked to play games. Once we went down to Havana together and we were played as being spies because everyone knew the government was going to fall. The difference between playing a spy and being a real spy is in the stakes of the game. Because the game is always the same. Harry was a real spy as well as one who played at it, but he never wanted to play for high stakes. The stakes made the game serious, and that is how you tell whether the game is worth playing. So he says, Harry was fun once, and he taught me this code. He was fun to be with at the time. We went down to Havana to spy on Batista. I didn't take Harry seriously before we began to play this game together. After that, I took him more seriously, but I hated him enough to kill him if I had not been ill. So he's mentioning that this ARC intelligence agent has taught him a code that he can write through these books about what's going on. And he's saying in Hemingway's notebook, in this book, the character, November Man, is saying, look, Hemingway taught him this code, and he used the code in Islands of the Stream. So I think here are the factors that I take out of this book, for my own context and looking at it. One, everyone seems to know that Hemingway had something. There was a piece left there, and that these agencies were after it. The interesting piece about Kennedy setting up his own intelligence unit to watch them and calling it our section, I think, is interesting. But the third part, which I think is crucial, which is that Hemingway was writing in code. And so the book that he's supposed to be writing in code, this notebook, is the one where he employs the code, is Bimini. So we've got this overhang from the deep state interaction between Hemingway and the CIA. Remember, Hemingway's son was a CIA agent, after all, and he's the father of Mariel and Margot. So what's interesting, if you look at that, is that Hemingway was afraid of his own son because he thought, he's going to report my activities back to the CIA. He thought he was such a loyalist that he would, sort of rat him out for the different contacts that he was making. At the crux of all this is Lester Hemingway and Ernest Hemingway both knowing and being involved in the Atlantis secret, and Grace Hall Hemingway having that connection with Cayce, and her being his mother, and him living on Bimini, and Lester going to Bimini 5 years earlier when Casey's giving these readings about Bimini and Atlantis. That Poseidia connection in the hot zone, and then the deep state figures that filter through, whether it's Robert Vesco or Howard Hughes and the various people. But in this book, in this Hemingway's notebook, we have this fictionalized version that there's some code, there's some notebook, there's something that Hemingway had. This is the same echo that we saw in the Blacklist show when they were saying Vesco, he found these Spanish galleons, he had all this gold, and that's what they're making these episodes about. He faked his death. This is where reality meets fiction on a number of these things, but really the fiction overlay is just an echo from stories that hang around and ricochet around, because those stories have their origin in fact. And with that, Miss Olivia, your questions are up.
Kat Goda gets the first question.
Oh, yeah.
Does DJ believe Hemingway killed himself or was murdered? He was only 62. Harsh way to kill yourself with a shotgun to the head.
Well, yeah. What's interesting is a friend of his said the night before he felt that feds were following him, and he drove around with Hemingway, and that Hemingway was acting really weird, and he would stop and say, see that car across the street? Those two men in it have been following me all day. So either he killed himself and was driven to it, or they arranged it conveniently, but certainly they had done a number of things to him, including electroshock therapy there at the end, so that he was gradually deteriorating. And, it's funny because he had incredible disdain for his father's suicide. And so the idea that he would repeat that, and then the fact that Lester would take his own life in the same fashion 20 years later. And Lester, I think, was 67 at the time. So you have Margot's suicide is also unusual if you look at the various details. And there are people who talked to her the night before, said she had all these projects lined up. They had just spoken to her recently. She didn't seem to have, she'd had problems with depression and things. So it's hard to rank, but certainly there's a deep state thread and pressure on that family. And the impression that I get from observing things and people around the Hemingways is they don't understand themselves. The younger set, Mariel, Margot, and late Margot, and their other sister, who's had her mental problems. It's like they don't understand what that problem is. What is it? Their dad was a CIA agent. They were abused as kids. There's Ernest Hemingway and all of his connections. They don't know what the pressure is, but that pressure leads to incredible depression and anxiety. So I think that's what's going on there, which is there's a deep state secret relating to intelligence work and the hot zone and the early group that was studying Cuba that I believe included Thomas Townsend Brown and John F. Kennedy and Hemingway. That thread is there, and all of them were in intelligence. Early intelligence, pre-CIA intelligence. See, the CIA it's extra-constitutional intelligence. It's not a legitimate intelligence agency. So when it's created not out of military expediency, but out of the expediency of these Wall Street lawyers. So its foundation is already problematic. What they were doing in the 30s was real intelligence work, in fact. And so there was an intelligence link there. And I think that we can find the links to those groups. Yes.
Melissa Clawerda, Hemingway and Kennedy Curse, related?
This is so interesting because, when you think about the Kennedys themselves, I mean, they have incredible wealth, incredible fame, and everything else. So obviously, an incredibly large family, and they've done incredible things to move the culture forward. I mean, so it's quite a legacy. So it's hard to think of them as cursed, but really it does seem that they've been targeted over a long period of time. One of the things that RFK Jr. mentioned to me when we talked and we did an interview was that he'd learned from a long time ago that the CIA had issues already with his family way before JFK got into the presidency, but that really heightened it to such a level. They couldn't believe that Kennedy said, well, I have a new frontier. We're going to give people freedom, and we're going to organize these nations around the theme of peace. They couldn't believe that he was that arrogant. They were thinking to themselves, we've been running the world the last 20 years. You're not going to change the way that what we're doing. When we don't like a country, we roll in and we overthrow the government. We figured out these ways to manipulate the press, and if that doesn't work, then we'll blow up trains and do other things. So, Kennedy is really an incredible thorn in their side. But the thing is that animosity was growing before and involved Kennedy's dad and other people. So it gets very dicey when you look at that relationship. And fundamentally, it seems like the main burden that the Kennedys have had to shoulder is the incredible animosity from the Central Intelligence Agency. Yeah.
I didn't know if you knew this, but W.C. Ray says Walter Bosley just reported that USOs are the biggest topic at the convention he is presently attending.
I don't know what conference that is, but that's pretty interesting. I mean, USOs are fascinating, and the history down there in the hot zone of things, people seeing that. What's interesting is it's not traditional. It's not just like, hey, I see a disc in the ocean or whatever. There's a whistleblower who worked at AUTEC who talked to the guys from UFO Hunters, which was a show that was around 2009, 2010. And you can still pick up that show on YouTube. There's still clips of it. And it's interesting because what happens is the guy says, what I saw on the radar was a landmass. So this landmass materialized in front of him. And they ask him, oh, was it a ship? Was it this? I said, no, it's a landmass. So when we think of that earlier report that I mentioned to you about 2 ocean floors, and then, it's almost like we're talking about something that warps into reality at different times and then warps out, like it's caught in a dimensional doorway of some kind. And that type of thinking and talking about it can get very ethereal. And yet, isn't that exactly the same thing that they're trying to do through CERN, and that they have achieved to some degree through our friends in the Philadelphia experiment? Well, we'll find out. We sure as heck are going to find out. Yes.
Jens Engelsgaard Daniel, can you please elaborate on the role of Costa Rica?
Wow, that's a really good question. There was a president of Costa Rica who protected our friend Vesco, and this guy was very interesting because he was closely associated with JFK, and JFK's whole approach to these Latin nations was, if we can get them together, then they can naturally repel this big communist push, without us having to go to war every time somebody switches to communism. And so what's interesting is he relays a story. I was just reading a story from the Kennedy Library where he's giving his testimony about the time that he was with Kennedy, and Kennedy came to Costa Rica and promoted these universities and things. When he learns that Kennedy dies, he's with President Eisenhower, former President Eisenhower, who he claims basically has a heart attack at the news. This is something I've never seen or read anywhere before, but I found it fascinating testimony. And we know that Eisenhower had around 1955, had a heart attack, and then Nixon took over for a couple of weeks, but then he recovered and he was fine. But on the news of hearing about this, that Ike basically had an attack. So I found that fascinating. I don't think that's been on the record. I haven't seen it before. So, but this character gets mixed up with Vesco. And again, he gets into the idea of creating an island, autonomous sovereign island. And Vesco is like, I'm going to call it New Aragon. And this is interesting too, because Aragon is a place in Spain that in the Middle Ages kind of developed this autonomy. And the fact that Vesco was thinking, I'm going to go into these islands, and create a new, tropical paradise type thing, is interesting. Or is it that these people, when they get up to a certain level of money, they've heard this story, they've heard the thing about land rising, and they want to be there when it happens and start a whole new nation? Because the idea is, when those things rise up in international waters, that it's anybody's game. Anybody is going to be able to claim it and start a new nation with it. So it seems to me that this is, the kind of open secret of the whole thing is, in the hot zone, there's an understanding, one, that there's extensive ruins of an advanced culture way beyond the Egyptians, and two, that culture, the land is rising beneath the ocean floor, and that culture is going to be revealed. And all these nations have positioned themselves there for this overlay. And just to make it really over the top, one of the things that Cayce said was in that temple off Bimini is what? Information about the Two-Eye Stone, which ran the whole world at a certain point. So, if the CIA is interested in Noah's Ark, and if they'll put people in the ARE to spy on the Hall of Records, then, this is pretty interesting to me. It tells me that they're very geared up for that. Egerton Sykes, retired UK spy, for years did lectures on Atlantis, and he said, what? All these countries are positioned there. China was positioned, South American countries, Cuba, the United States, Mexico, and they're all positioned around the hot zone for this whole history-changing archaeology that's down there. I think it goes way beyond Spanish galleons, but I love the code work. Yes.
Okay, Renner Newton, could the landmass be cloaked?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. I mean, this guy was completely legitimate witness. He had worked at Autec, and he said the thing that freaked him out was, this landmass showed up on his radar, and there was no malfunction, and it was there for a while, and then it left. It was gone. So the thing that he was reading was a landmass, wasn't a ship, and they questioned him, etc. It reminded me of this 70s documentary where it was a Bermuda Triangle one, and there was a captain of the ship talking about going in at night and having some problems, some malfunctions happening, and then they look in front of them, and there's a gigantic, as far as the eye can see, kind of mass there, and it's like a huge obelisk. It's like the obelisk from 2001. And the closer they get to this thing, they're trying to get information on it, and the closer they get to this thing, the more that their boat is malfunctioning, so that at a certain point they just decide, let's get the hell out of here. Can you imagine running into something like that late at night in those waters? So just absolutely fascinating. Look, we have all the stories about the Bermuda Triangle. The hot zone is in that vicinity, and we get the same type of magnetic anomalies in the hot zone, but the idea of ruins is actually way more extensive in the hot zone than in the Bermuda Triangle. So that whole area, whatever it was, and the whole apotheum that affects that area, it's still a factor, and no question about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, deep tonight on the deep state and Atlantis, and we're going to be taking some more of your questions. This is episode 124, and we've got the hot zone factor involved. Vesco, Hemingway, Cayce, they're all there. Nixon, JFK, they're positioned. They've all had these deep interactions. Nixon's major financier, B.B. Rebozo, he lives an island hop.
Babe Russell's favorite.
He lives an island hop away from Vesco. I mean, these guys have set up these little palace nations, right? But in the case of Vesco, he wanted to start a new micronation the same way Lester Hemingway did. They're aware of something, and they're aware of the positioning, the location being crucial. That is the thing that we're trying to bring out of all these different stories. And in terms of the, whether or not the AIDS drug would have worked or anything, it's interesting how fast they ran Vesco to prison after all that time, and how they booted Nixon, Don Nixon out. So it makes you wonder about that TX story, and I'm very open to something that was going on there that was major, because it just seems like a lot of activity. And the Clinton administration, their kind of proposition to Don Nixon, basically, like, just don't mention this stuff again and we won't bother you anymore. Yeah.
Okay. As always, we have so many questions about the Two-Eye Stone and CERN.
All right.
We could just spend the rest of the show talking about that.
Find the greatest of the great.
Okay. So Jordan Banner, is CERN really practicing for when they recover the Two-Eye Stone? So if we assume that the government wants the Two-Eye Stone for their own use, do they have people who can use it on the Belial Group's side? Do we have someone on our side who has this knowledge?
Well, somebody, let's presume that what Cayce said about them discovering part of the Firestone. Okay, so Cayce would mention the Two-Eye Stone, and then he talked about the Firestone. And the Firestone was like a portable version of the big thing. It's kind of like, imagine you're walking around with like an iPad and you're connected to this larger thing. So the Firestone, he said, was already recovered, and they know so little about them. And he was telling this one guy that if he studied them and learned what they were about, he'd have to be careful, because he might repeat the same mistakes that he made in Atlantis previously. Think about that. So this guy, basically had a destructive role in Atlantis with the crystals, and he shows up and he learns about this stuff. He's fascinated by it again, but the trick is he might learn about it and destroy things again. So this is the kind of the nature of the situation I think we find ourselves in, rediscovering this technology and rediscovering and remaking this world. It is definitely a rediscovery of something that caused incredible destruction at a certain point long ago. The CERN aspect, which uses the sun and affects the magnetosphere, this is interesting because the Two-Eye Stone uses the sun also. So there's an overlay, there's an overlap with it. So what I would say is these stones that they found and that Cayce said were shipped off to Pennsylvania and the University of Pennsylvania, that somebody in there studied that stuff. My guess is it went from there to the Smithsonian and then became part of a major scientific project. Even if they had heard about the Cayce readings on it, they would have done that. So that stuff tends to disappear into a void while those people work on it and don't share it with the culture. So that's the whole, X technology piece. So it seems to make sense to me that the piece that they found relating to the two-eye stone in the miniature firestones that Cayce referred to, and he referred very specifically to even the name of the archaeological expedition. So I think that kind of specificity is really interesting, and it tells me somebody took that stuff and they went deep into it. So I would say, yeah, they have an aspect of it. Now, I don't think that what Cayce's discussing in terms of the two-eye stone we have in our possession and they're using it. I think that they found aspects of it and have studied them. And I think that they want total control of the hot zone for that reason. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, did Cayce ever allude to CERN?
Well, I mean, he talked about, this is the thing. CERN was created in 1959, so that's 14 years after Cayce died. By the way, it was set up by with the help of John J. McCloy. And John J. McCloy is not only the journalist who interviews Hitler in 1936, but he is one of the principal members of the Warren Commission. And, he's a big Rockefeller VP. But what's interesting about that is CERN develops the particle collider. And CERN is originally a nuclear body studying nuclear, all these different types of nuclear effects. What happens to it is it becomes set up as a particle accelerator, and they start to reproduce Big Bang conditions, supposedly, and they become the #1 user of the internet very early on, which I think is interesting. So CERN is a great mystery, but it's being reborn now. It went from $6 billion to $20 billion. It's been offline for 3 years. Boom, it's back. So it definitely has that overhang, of CERN. But in terms of what Cayce would say about it, Cayce often alluded to the fact that we were going to develop things that would have the ability to either make our lives great or decimate and cause destruction, and that it was up to the individual choice and all the rest of it. But that he warns often about destruction in relation to what humanity is moving toward and how it has to be guided by a higher ideal, which it has not been for a long time. I think Kennedy actually is the last, on that level, there are some things that happen on the major world level. One of them is Kennedy and his negotiations for the nuclear test ban treaty, taking us away from war and the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Reagan with Gorbachev in 1987, collaborating, talking about the ET possibility of an invasion and things, but creating this incredible pact not to reduce all of their nuclear stockpiles and not to create an arms race. Those things, I think, have incredible reverberations. But, on top of that, we have the 9/11 illness and, the ops that they're doing, the COG work, and the worldwide dictatorship that's moving in on us. So it's hard to say which way it's going to go, right? But certainly both elements are active. Yeah.
This is fascinating. Okay, so Golden Girl says 5,000 Kelvin. That is cold, DJ. Opening portals to let the interdimensional regressive groups in. Not nice. Not nice. Sacred Forest says, I think they want to open the gate for the Antichrist to come join the fun. But I do want to bring this in. Zenfu says about CERN, do you believe that they can use it for changing timelines? I do. Carla Struble, didn't Farrell say CERN could change our whole magnetic field? And Jay Vanderbest said, did CERN destroy our reality and create another in 2012? These things a few years ago, I would have thought were junk conspiracy. I'm really starting to believe.
Well, there's so many waves of unusual activity going on right now that if you want to drill down with what Farrell said, it's pretty interesting because what he said related actually to the Mandela effect. And, you know, we know the classic thing about, oh, you heard about this name when you were a child, you know, Warner Brothers, but now it's Warner Brothers. And so there's a number of different things in relation to this. And what Farrell said it was possibly was somebody playing with the medium. That is playing with the fabric of reality itself and seeing, since so much of science is the reaction of how we respond to something, right? It actually makes the effect. That this could be in relation to how we would respond. And I think that some of that Mandela shifting thing, you know, it's been overblown and people have said, hey, what about this? And it was completely, you know, I get this a lot where people say, hey, there used to be 4 people in the Kennedy assassination car and now there's 6. No, there was always 6, you know, so there's some things that are just wrong and junk on it. However, I've noticed in at least several instances, things where they've changed, they definitely have changed the dates of things. They've definitely changed incidents. And it's different than just memory holing something. So I do think somebody is playing with the medium. And I think the Mandela effect is something that made people catch on. But yeah, I mean, it's tricky. When you get into CERN, what you want to do is figure out what is a particle accelerator and where does that technology come from? You know, I mentioned that they used to sell portable versions of this thing. I mean, they're big, but there used to be versions that were available that the Varian brothers created, scale models of this thing. And what is that technology and why do other countries want to develop their own versions of CERN? Why is CERN a sovereign entity that can't be sued as these scientists try to sue it for the possible creation of strangelets, which technically could create black holes, but the chance was so infinitesimal. Well, so there was a really interesting lawsuit around that. It came out of Hawaii, actually, and the scientists were very concerned about the impact of CERN on the environment. And this thing it got buried, and they don't like people questioning what CERN is. So, but again, it's that particle accelerator aspect of CERN, because CERN is a body that does other things. There's weird people involved around CERN, like Tom Hanks, Sally Fields. This is pretty interesting. So yeah, I think with it being started back up, it's time to take a good new look at the whole thing. Yes.
What is the thing about the lion laying down with the lamb that's different from the Bible?
Yeah, that's true. Now supposedly they're saying, oh, it's the wolf with the lamb. There's a few things like that which just seem like real obvious examples. Some things are very easily explained as, you know, just like when they do BCE on this before Common Era. That way we don't have to say Christ. You know, I mean, there's a lot of just things that they've done where they've changed, and that comes more from like a social engineering, psychological massage point of view. But that is interesting. I think there are some pretty obvious ones that have changed. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, does DJ have an opinion on this new alleged Looking Glass tech group on the scene?
You know, it was brought up during my interview with Alexandra Bruce, and she had some things to say about it. I think she was kind of having fun with it. And I don't think that, you know, the Looking Glass thing, it's interesting because there's a real story. And just like in dark journalism, there's the real story there's the junk conspiracy, and so on we go. There's the official story, and then there's the secondary story, which turns out to be true, but is called the conspiracy theory. So we have to be careful when we get into these things, because Looking Glass, the idea has been seen by somebody that we have a kind of technology that looks into the future. There's no question about that. I absolutely believe that. And I think the work of T.T. Brown brings us there. But this other thing, if you listen to those videos and they're like, we're going to choose the 50 most worthy, and, they will know when they're chosen. Don't give me a YouTube religion. That's not good. That's not good. And they're like, one of the signs that the things we're saying are going to come to pass is that our channel is going to be taken down. Look, I mean, they take people's channels down for all kinds of little reasons. So, no, the original Looking Glass piece that they're riffing on definitely has some weight to it. And there were guys like, who came out, and you could believe them or not, Dan Burish, who had worked at Area 51, who said this is what they used Looking Glass for. And it seemed to me like he was trying to be like a Bob Lazar type guy. And Lazar's story is weird enough, but there's definitely something to a lot of those stories. And it's not, it's almost like somebody's seen just a little bit of something and has to keep going with it,
Let me ask you a question, though. If there's disinfo about something, that's deliberate.
Yes.
Is it because they don't want you on to the real story about it, so it's obfuscating it? It's a misdirection. So
yes.
Would that speak to the fact that there is something there, and they're afraid that you're going to find it, so they say, oh, no, take this detour, or this is the answer, right? And we're going to give you your very own whistleblower to tell you the truth about it, right? But it's going to be...
Oh, yeah.
Incomplete truth?
Well, think about how they control the news cycle. I mean, you have your brain pushed hardcore on COVID. And what was the last version of COVID again?
What
the most recent? No. Even before that, Omicron, right? So they beat you over the head with that, and then they switched it to Ukraine war, right? And they were like, oh, we may have to go nuclear on that. What are you kidding me? First of all, we don't have any strategic interest in Ukraine, none, right? That's one. And two, our government made a pledge to Gorbachev that if he would help us expedite reuniting Germany, that we wouldn't move east with NATO. Very simple. We have moved east with NATO, but okay, whatever. It hasn't gone right on their doorstep. You can't put NATO, Ukraine on the doorstep of Russia. You're going to get a really bad reaction. So, they need like a peace offensive in relation to that stuff. And that's not supposed to mean that Putin is a great guy or anything like that. It's just that these are the realities of the geopolitics, So what's weird, I'm going to tell you a really strange thing, and think about it. The force that Putin is fighting, right, that's moving into Ukraine, are the same people that we don't agree with, right? So we don't want the World Economic Forum to run the world. We don't want digital IDs. And that's the same group that's trying to set up Ukraine as like, this new world order paradise. So this is a weird thing to find ourselves in league mentally with the same thing that a foreign country is doing. America is supposed to be the beacon of hope and freedom and spreading freedom. So why is America promoting things like Schwab and Gates, these people that are trying to, keep us in a digital slave camp and move us into this kind of horror show dictatorship? Global COG, basically, we should be more on the side of hope and freedom. And a country like Russia, should be way behind us on that. But instead, they're calling out that whole thing. And then, they're doing this totally wrong thing, I think, going into Ukraine and going after them. But, still, it is interesting. Haven't we arrived at an interesting point where we're no longer the beacon of creating hope and freedom in the world? We're the ones who are supporting this group, which is not even an American group, to basically cause a global digital dictatorship. Yeah. I'm against them. The global dictatorship. Oh no. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Keep rolling.
Okay. So
this is just the thing. I want to make the point so clearly that it's interesting. It's just like with the Democrats and Republicans. Some people write to me and they're like, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and something you said about Bernie Sanders, like, I don't care. Whoever it is, Republican, Democrat, Green Party, whoever, if they support the Constitution, I'm with you 100%. That should be the attitude of people on the ground. Party affiliation and stuff like that, I'm sorry, it doesn't mean anything anymore. It literally doesn't. You should be an independent and have those parties vie for your vote, because what they've done, I mean, the DNC is so influenced by China. You might as well be voting for China to take over America. So, and both parties have this corrupt glow about them, and you need a new party. You need a whole clean slate. But the idea is fundamentally, whoever it is, they have to say, one, we don't get the ability through emergency powers to put you into a fascist state. We're living under emergency powers now, which came from the September 11th attack. We're still under those powers. Democrats and Republicans sign on to them every year. They have no problem. Here's the $800 billion for the military, and give us our cut. And so Democrats and Republicans in Congress get along just fine. There's no gridlock. They love each other. When it comes to that $800 billion and the emergency powers, they're great. They love each other, baby. They're, it's yachts and saunas all the way. But on this other stuff, that terrible, like Nancy Pelosi, that terrible Trump or DeSantis, and I mean, when we get right down to it, what's going on there? Can nobody take on the National Defense Authorization Act or the emergency powers thing? Is it just off the table forever? Who's going to take that on? So you can look to those things to see where the world should be moving. But I just wanted to say globally, as far as the world is concerned, we can't allow for the World Economic Forum and all these forces to create a digital gulag. And in that sense, then we find ourselves, it's like, I don't want us to turn into Russia or China. That's the thing. So, we have the situation where when you're looking at Russia, now it's just, they're villains, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in any international diplomacy situation, you say, what causes them to act like that? And the fact that we're putting NATO on their doorstep is a provocation. So we gave them the ability to do that. So you never want to do that. So if anything, we need to get real leadership and get Biden, Stepford Biden and that whole regime out. That can only be the goal. Yes.
Okay. Switching gears.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of talk about this. Zach Robinson wants to know, what's DJ's take on the JFK assassination being faked? Jay Widener thinks Headshot was a squib. First film to use a blood squib was River of No Return, starring Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah. No, it's, I mean, that's a joke,
Jay is very sincere about it, though. We want to acknowledge,
No, it's dumb. He shouldn't be doing that.
Of course he shouldn't, but he believes it.
It's stupid. No, I mean, the whole culture was turned upside down by that. And, we have enough junk conspiracy, and, Jay does his own stuff, whatever. I hope he does well. But, he also was the director of the Cosmic Disclosure Freak Show. And he did come out later and say, well, I shouldn't have worked with those guys. So I don't know. When I hear stuff like that, I get the whole junk conspiracy marketing thing going in my head. So yeah, I don't have a lot of patience for that kind of stuff. Let's move into, there's so much real stuff to do, and a guy like that that's done interesting work around Kubrick and things like that. That's what you want to see on that tip. Don't you want to see all those other researchers in the field too, who kissed up to the CIA on the UFO file? Like, don't you want to see all those people go back to doing real work and stop touting this whole wave of nonsense? The CIA has their own abductees now, and they're going to be on the UFO circuit. And, here's CIA Agent 1. I was taken on a table. Come on. This thing, there's so many interesting, powerful stories and things that we can use our minds on, So let's get with the good stuff, because that that's what I'm here for. I didn't come into alternative independent research to get caught up in the same fantasies as mainstream media does. We're supposed to be doing something here that's different, and that's what we're going to do. Yes.
Huster, McAfee, hidden hot zone connection?
Oh my God. You know, when I was reading about Vesco, I kept thinking about McAfee. And I have no doubt that McAfee was also trying to figure out if he couldn't create a floating nation of some sort. And, you know, McAfee's a tough story because he was definitely bumped off. And I think that he had very powerful kind of information relating to the deep state in America. And I think that's what the chase was all about, et cetera. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of strange things about McAfee and his whole story as well. But I think him dying was a tremendous shock, really, because there was this supposition that he had left enough material as a kind of a dead man switch type thing, and that they wouldn't move against him. This, I think, brings us into the Assange story as well. It makes me think of that because, you know, Trump had the opportunity to pardon Assange, and I really feel like he should have. That was a great failure of the Trump presidency, because he talked about it later and said, you know, I weighed this out very heavily because I knew this guy was really working on something. And in truth, I don't think Trump would have got in without the releases from WikiLeaks against the Clinton campaign. And I think he did that because he knew what an incredibly corrupt figure Hillary Clinton was, and how she had basically directed all of the, you know, the tearing down of the Libyan state to become a chaotic mess, failed state. So I think he felt a responsibility to help get her out of office, and you know, or not allow her to assume the presidency. And so I think that Trump missed it there, because I think he really got in there with the support of this really powerful thing. And he used to quote WikiLeaks on the campaign trail and talk about how much he loved them. And then once he got in there, it was like, oh, I don't know who they are, you know. So it's a great lesson, I think. Yes.
All right, let's go back to Elon Musk.
Wait, before we go any further, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 124. And I'm telling you, the deep state aspect of the hot zone is where so much of our focus is leaning right now. And remember, we had Ghislaine down there, we had Epstein down there, and who were they with? They were with the likes of Marvin Minsky from MIT. And who was Marvin Minsky connected to? Well, he was close friends with Colonel Sanders' daughter, and we did a whole episode on the Colonel in the hot zone. These connections are there, and they have that kind of steady impact on us on a regular basis. They are there for us to find. And I think I have it right here, but yes. The Colonel's Secret. This is Margaret Sanders' book. And you know, Margaret Sanders, what did she do? Well, she was remarkable in that she put together an entire group and called it Mars to find Cayce's Poseidia off Bimini. And in fact, it was her son, Trig Adams, who I've spoken to, that had the ability to, he was the first one who found it. So it's very, very interesting when you think about how these things link up. And we have to kind of remember that. I also want to put on the record that there have been people that were associated with the hot zone who at a certain point just went running. And I'm not sure if they were warned off or whatever, but we were talking very seriously. We were working on things, and then they disappeared in thin air. So those things happen sometimes, but they make me wonder, of course, about the future of this kind of work and how to get people to come forward and give us that kind of information, because a lot of key leads will disappear because things get too intense or they're afraid. So that's a big question that people like me really need to solve. And we in the Ideas Room need to think about how to create the kind of space where a whistleblower can come forward that's genuine. So very interesting. Yes.
Okay, so Elon Musk, Zane Ivey. I'm curious, which, quote, society with secrets or mystery school Elon Musk is a member of? Gigi Abby Lynn says, with Elon, he wants you looking up. But being that he's Elon, you should look down, boring, down. And Melody Len says, what if Elon said he will keep satellites up for Ukraine because it was a troll to the deep state WEF, NATO globalists, as if to say, quote, I can monitor what you are really doing in Ukraine. Checkmate?
No, because, see, whenever somebody says that about Musk, they don't understand how satellites work. Satellites are approved by the NRO, right? That's the deep state U.S. government connection directly. The deep state can tap on that anytime that they want to. The idea is they want to control the ground from the sky. So they're not going to give him carte blanche in space and then he's going to dictate rules to them. So we have to kind of get our heads around it. It would be nice if he had something and he was, if he was this incredible idealist and he had something to checkmate them with. Unfortunately, he doesn't. But I do think what you can say for sure about the Musk style of influence. And it's this, which is what's happening, in fact, is that there are forces, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, who realize that the censorship approach is making them look bad and that they're going to get blown out in elections, one, but two, in terms of the public discussion and the court of public opinion, they're starting to look like they're repressive speech people. And what happened is the people at Twitter, the people at Facebook thought they could just take over. Now, the earlier deep state, the Rockefellers and those types of people, they would do the same types of things. However, they would back off. They would weigh things out. They would never let themselves be exposed to that level. They may both have the same type of goals, but they don't like to be embarrassed. They do not like to be embarrassed. So when they're caught out, and we know, for example, the Hunter Biden laptop is a great example, when Twitter said it's Russian disinformation, 51 intelligence officials went on the record, the media went on the record, and then now the New York Times says, well, actually, the laptop is legit and all the stuff that's on there is legit. It means someone doesn't have credibility anymore, right? Except for people who are fanatically crazy about one side or the other. And what it means is that the people who repressed speech and took away the First Amendment, committed basically the crime of being repressive, which is what the whole platform, things like Twitter and all that stuff, they're supposed to be saying, oh, we're supposed to be so open and these other countries are so bad, and we're so open. So when they were doing it and they were taking away the president's ability to tweet and things like that, I mean, so they just prove themselves out to be fascists, digital fascists. And that's the tag they're getting labeled with now. People are waking up. It takes a while, right? My God, we've been talking about it for how long? But the public eventually catches up, and they're catching up now. That's why you see Jack from Twitter coming out and saying, it wasn't me, it was that terrible board. It was, CNN made me do it. And so, that's good in a sense, because it means that the tide is turning back there. But I don't trust those people. If they felt that they were succeeding with that fascism, they just keep going with it. So I think that we have to view everyone on that level with a certain type of suspicion, and that I think that we need a new paradigm of interplay between in a cycle of understanding and respect between the people on the ground, the regular citizens of the countries, and those who are in the leadership and in the corporate leadership. It needs to be a totally different conversation. I said a while ago, I thought it would be facilitated by a citizens committee of ordinary people who wouldn't be subject to lobbyists, wouldn't be subject to corporate pressures, and those people could basically get the whole heft of the feeling on the ground and convey it to these other people that are supposed to represent us. And in that way, those people could get some kind of credibility back. Otherwise, you've got, Biden at 28%, Trudeau, his party is under 30%, and those people are controlling things. Those, they don't have any popularity. So their popularity is underwater. And that's why I think you see these moves. And I think Elon is part of that group that's like, we want to be popular again. I don't think that makes him any kind of idealist at all. So I just see that there's a group inside there that they don't like how they're being painted. Yes.
This is so great. Times Squared says, saw Colonel Sanders at Norman Vincent Peale's church,
Wow.
5th Avenue and 31st Street, New York City. Same church as
Donald Trump.
Parents.
Oh, right. Yes. Oh, hey, look, the Colonel was, he got deeply involved with Christian stuff, but he seemed to have that mind over matter thing. He was incredibly focused. And the daughter, if you read her book, she's involved with all these psychics, and she's involved with really, she does sculptures for Winston Churchill and Ike and things like that, So, and she's at the White House with Nixon and stuff. This is a family that's deep, deep into it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here in episode 124. This is Deep State in the Hot Zone. We went in through Robert Vesco and some of the incredible players like Hemingway and Cayce, all the way down to Don Nixon, which is a little different than John Kennedy. We're taking your questions here. We're going to take a few more. And by the way, I want to remind you to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter. That's the way that we stay in touch through the incredible and harsh censorship that we've been seeing across the board, with people getting thrown off social media left and right. But I do feel like, there's a lot of platforms rising, and it's kind of forcing these other platforms to get their act together. So the only way that we can guarantee ourselves of a good, steady communication is through that newsletter. So make sure you sign up for it. It's free, but it lets you know once a week the shows that we have coming up for you, and the incredible interviews, events, and documentaries, things you won't believe coming up for the rest of the spring, and of course right through June. Yes.
This sounds fascinating. Gringo 1111. Have you heard of the island in the south of Chile that supposedly appears and disappears? I believe it's called Paradise. And in the 80s, there was contact with extraterrestrials that resided there. This is something to follow up on.
Where is it?
It's the south of Chile.
Interesting. Yeah. When you mention that, it reminds me of the UMO visits, this alien visits that are happening in Italy. I don't know. Those stories are really fascinating, but I'll tell you, South America seems to be the hotspot for so much UFO activity. And I think it's because there isn't such a heavy-duty military presence. And I think the military presence dissuades the kind of regular contacts that have occurred over history. Because, there's a gigantic dip, it seems like, in alien contact. If you study it, through the 60s and the 90s, there's all these physical contacts and people being abducted and all that stuff. And then abruptly, sometime in the 2000s, it seems to stop. So, I mean, are we going to look back at the abduction phenomena as a historical thing that just took place for a certain period of time? Makes you wonder. Yes.
This is fascinating. Josh says, Fortune Germain, direct ancestor of Saint Germain, claimed recently the Hall of Records under the Sphinx has been found. Not sure if they know what to do with it, though.
Yeah, he's supposed to be a relative of Saint Germain.
Fortune? I would imagine it's a female.
Yeah, someone sent me something about that and said that they talked about the Two-Eye Stone. I haven't seen them or the work that they do, so I don't know, but I'd love to see more people get on board and study the Two-Eye Stone in relation to Atlantis rising and land rising, because I think these are crucial pieces. They're left there, I think, by the mystery schools as a piece. It's like something you're supposed to follow up on. It's like a gift in a sense. So what could that all be about, land rising? Well, we try to give some context for that on the show. Yes.
Robert Ayala, is this Vesco related to Renato Vesco, who wrote the book Intercept UFO, but Don't Shoot?
I know that guy's from Italy, the other one. And I didn't find any family correlation, but it was interesting. And I'd like to know more about that other Vesco's UFO stuff. I didn't really get too much into it because I couldn't find anything that directly linked them. Although Vesco's upbringing is interesting. He said he had 3 goals when he was growing up, and they were, the first one was to get out of Detroit. And the second one was to become a major CEO, and the third one was to become a millionaire. And he was able to do that, but unfortunately, he was also a drug-pushing criminal. So what I didn't get to, which is interesting, is the crisscross with this episode and an episode of Female Targets about Vicki Morgan. And I'll do this for a moment because I think it's interesting. By the way, before I put this away, Bill Granger, Hemingway's Notebook, that's the book I was referring to earlier. Very interesting stuff. But I have something here. Let's see. And it is Bernie Kofeld. Bernie Kofeld is the interesting crossover here. And again, remember, this is Vesco. Vesco took over for Kofeld. And it was the struggling mutual fund company called iOS. And the idea was, in the 60s, these U.S. servicemen could invest in a mutual fund just for servicemen. And it grew gigantically, but suddenly it was making risky investments in the Arctic. And the people got suspicious for a while, and then the guy who owned that, Bernie Kofeld, became this incredible force in Hollywood, in international politics, in all these things. And he was chased, just like Vesco was chased, from country to country, looking for solace away from these charges that he had embezzled all this money from the mutual funds. So what happens is Vesco rolls in and takes over Kofeld's mutual fund operation, and he does the same thing, but on a more elaborate level. After stabilizing it out, he makes an even bigger grab of the mutual fund money. Now, this is a shot of Kofeld.
Isn't it Kornfeld?
Kornfeld. And Bernie Kornfeld. And what's interesting is he strikes me as someone that, he basically knew the levers of power on the deep state side, and he controlled Hollywood so heavy duty in the 70s that he was best friends with Warren Beatty and Michelle Phillips. But what's interesting to me is his relationship with our friend Vicki Morgan, who was the mistress of Bloomingdale, who used her as kind of a deep state blackmail tool for, setting her up with the King of Morocco and things like that. And of course, Vicki was found dead. But I think that Kornfeld is one of those keys. And so again, Vesco taking over the company that Kornfeld had stolen all this money from, and then doing the same thing, gives us that weird crisscross that you see sometimes from the Female Target episodes to the HotZone episodes. And that's fascinating. Yes.
Victrola 13, why do we see so much engineering with chemtrails, geoengineering with chemtrails in the hot zone?
Yeah, there's a lot of activity going on down there. And just to think about it, Rockwell International was down there, major military contractors. NASA is there. The Chinese are there. All of these offshore banks are there. All the drug running is there. Everything operates really in that zone, and it operates in a kind of lawlessness. Yeah, what do you got?
Thermobsterful says Kornfeld is in Mark Rich's family.
Yes, right. See, now that starts to add up. And Mark Rich, of course, is the billionaire financier on the run guy that Clinton pardoned. And, through Denise Rich, who did all these incredible outlays for the Clinton Foundation.
Where did they get their money? Was he like a hedge fund guy?
Oh, forget it. I mean, he was in so many different industries, involved in so many different ripoffs. But yes, fundamentally, he was like a criminal financier the same way. And what's interesting, I always found interesting about the Mark Rich pardon, which Clinton did, is that Jimmy Carter said it was one of the most disgusting things he'd ever seen in politics. Think about that. Jimmy Carter, the Democratic president, saying that about another Democratic, not Republican president. Whew. Wow. Very heavy duty. Yes.
I am pretty much out of questions.
That's good. There's a couple of quick things I wanted to put on the record here. And this will take us into the kind of next piece. But the thing I wanted to throw out there is about Adam Clayton Powell. And Adam Clayton Powell was like a major black figure in the 60s. And he was the congressman in this district that eventually Charles Rangel would take over. But he got into such legal trouble from diverting funds from his campaign and stuff to his various lifestyle activities that he moved to Bimini, and he ran his New York congressional district from Bimini. And one of the weird stories is that Clayton Powell got MLK to come down there, and MLK would do things like write, I have a dream speech down in Bimini. So Bimini, assumes all these different types of things. I found out that Harry Truman and Ike were both down there as well. So there's something quite special about it. You can just think of it as the island retreat aspect, of course, but I'm just going one better on that. In any case, what happens is he gets into trouble because Clayton Powell gets into trouble because he's giving all this money to this 21-year-old Miss Ohio who is working with him. And her name is Corinne Huff. That's a shot of her. It's a very interesting little backstory on Bimini because what happens is Premier Lyndon Pindling, who is the president of the Bahamas, 36-year-old attorney, now leads the Bahamas government, revealed that he personally owns shares in a controversial Adam Clayton Powell-connected corporation. Pindling also said that he formed Huff Enterprises, named for Powell's secretary, Corinne Huff. The corporation is under scrutiny by U.S. congressional probers, but its role in Powell's affairs is vague. There have been reports that the company pays some of Adam Clayton Powell's bills at his Bimini Island retreat. However, Premier Pindling said that there was nothing illegal about the corporation and it would continue to operate. An account of Pindling's statements was published by the Tribune. This is interesting because everywhere you turn around Bimini and the hot zone and the political interest, they're using it for some extra, it's like some extra account, some extra way to do things. And in this case, in a remote place, running his district from Bimini, and they try to take his seat away from him, and he goes through to the Supreme Court and gets his seat back, even though he's running, from Bimini. So it's a very interesting story about Bimini involvement in regular politics. But Clayton Powell is one of these guys that you would think, oh, hey, he was the first congressman who was black from New York. They'd celebrate this guy, whatever. This guy is down the memory hole big time because of all these troubles, I'm sure. But oddly enough, there he is kind of hanging out in the middle of all this. And Corinne Huff, who is this 21-year-old beauty queen, what does he do with her? He creates a corporation with her. You see how these things work down there. It's it's a little bit different, and it gives us this kind of flavor of how the deep state operates. So, at first she's the mistress of this congressman, and then suddenly she is a corporation, and the president of the Bahamas owns shares in her corporation. So the deep state is a very, in the hot zone, operates completely on this lawless, basis. And every once in a while through history, it gets exposed. And the people involved are like, what do I do? Do I turn myself in and face the charges, or do I just island hop in that deep state and hope for, a new break? So we've seen that a lot, but it seems like the key players who come up over and over again are related directly to the highest level of the government. Hemingway, with Mary Hemingway and Kennedy and getting the vault out of Cuba, or in the case of, there's just a number of examples, for example, with Nixon and Nixon's son involved with Vesco and Nixon's nephew. So, and then we have Nixon's brother involved with Hughes, and Hughes in the Bahamas at the Atlantis resort. It's like, at a certain point, it has to be looked at. What is it about the HotZone? Like, what's really going on down there? And is it the setup for an entire secondary government? Is that going to be the seat of government at a certain point? And this is where so much of the research that we're doing here is driving us towards some type of conclusion that there's something there which is not reported on at all. There's nothing, when you hear stories about like, oh, we've targeted Cuba for this and that, or there's Havana syndrome, where's the stuff coming from? And these are the questions I think that we need to ask. And that's why we're so deep here on the HotZone. So that's it for tonight. It's so great to be here with everyone.
I just got to throw this out here.
Yes.
Okay. Wild Tangent said Mark Rich worked with the Russian Vlad Dronin, who built Little St. James for Epstein. That is such great information.
Wow. I can only imagine doing a show on Rich would be fantastic. And what's interesting is, when they get at that point where they are just, billionaires or whatever, isn't it interesting that they got involved with Epstein at all? Because they could do all that stuff on their own, right? Create their own harems and all the rest of it. But instead, they go to this place and, this guy becomes their kind of international pimp. But it's weird because when you go deeper on that story, of course, it was Epstein taking the scientific community and saying, here, I'm going to place you, Marvin Minsky, for example, who we mentioned earlier. He has him involved. Well, why is he after Marvin Minsky? Minsky knows not only, incredible things. He's an incredible MIT physicist, but he's also good friends with Margaret Sanders, who's deep in the HotZone research. So it seems to me the hidden story with Janet Atlantis, aka Ghislaine Maxwell, and Epstein is that there's a major Atlantis push, HotZone piece associated with them. And that when we start to get our heads wrapped around Stephen Hawking being taken in submarines underneath the HotZone by the likes of Maxwell, then the whole thing starts to look very, very different. Because, what is it that they want these people to find out? What is it that they're trying to learn from them? It seems like they're after scientific validation of what they've discovered about the HotZone in relation to Atlantis, magnetic anomalies, etc. So we're in a weird place with that because there's so much evidence on the table, and we've brought a lot of it forward. But now we wonder, how does this all add up together?
This is great because this really ties it all up. Hinkelberger says, DJ, regarding a drug TX, remember Farrakhan went to Cuba for cancer treatments years ago and came back cured.
Interesting. Well, it's weird. That is weird. And the other interesting loop around that is that Vesco was doing all this business with Gaddafi in Libya. So that is quite fascinating. But the cancer piece with Farrakhan, it makes you wonder. And if they had that kind of miracle drug, if that part of the whole thing was real, what does that tell us? Quite fascinating indeed. So, Miss Olivia.
Okay, I have a bunch of super chatters to
Okay,
thank.
yes.
Okay, Occult Fan, Stephen, Erica Swenson Elliott, L3 Clown SACR3, Global Atlantis, Jim Sarge 3ID, James Nelson, The Drunken Scoundrel, Eurythmia's Fun, Bob Bindert, WC Ray, Bill 33, Doreen Hewitt, Thermobstrapal, Daneline Herbert, Medley Childress, Joe Sampson, Thomas Tyson, Debbie McAdoo, Shazam, Kelly Green, Aruna Gee, and Johnny Ricardo Bone. Thank you so much.
Wow. Fantastic. We really appreciate your support. And that's what helps us keep going here. And to all our subscribers, thank you. We really appreciate that kind of you guys backing us up so that we can do these kind of reports. And it makes all the difference to us, of course. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and make sure that you're signed up for our newsletter as well. And that's the easiest way to subscribe. Now, coming up, we have some incredible interviews coming up with you. I think I've talked Gigi Young into coming on quite soon. And we have Catherine Fitz, and we're going to have some very interesting surprise interviews for you. Incredible X-Series episodes, X-Series 125 coming up for you next Friday. So get ready for that. And I'm going to do a couple shout outs here. Richard Warner says, hit the like button. I like it. Al Kaider, it's great to see you. Deborah Sloan, Jennifer Walters. Yes, Joseph is back in the mix. I'm actually he's going to be back on the show pretty soon. And we just did that incredible piece on Russia, which we just, had to get that done, that deep state piece. But I have something very, very interesting to discuss with him. So we're going to do that. Catherine, yes, Catherine's coming up. She's doing a lot over there. Really going wild. There's Gigi. Hey, Gigi. It's great to see you. Fantastic. It's great to have you here. Kat, let's see. It's definitely very personal. It's very much, I was told by attorneys, really, and I'm like, no kidding. Oh, boy. Good luck with all that. Roosevelt. Great show as always, DJ. Thank you, sir. Much obliged. Really appreciate seeing you out there. Taj Jacobs. Thank you. Fubar Fighter. Excellent. Wow, so great to see so many familiar faces out there tonight. And yes, everyone keeps saying, thank you, Olivia. See, Olivia, nice round of applause. Bravissimo, back in style. Najat, great to see you. Oh, there we go. Thank you. And Laurent Rawlings out there. Jennifer and Bucks. Wayne Peak. Silver Fox. Something about political transcripts. I missed it. TJ reading political transcripts from JFK. What a nerd. Yeah. Well, Melissa. Hey, Melissa. It's great to see you out there. See you all next week. Yes. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Brenda Fisher. Fantastic. What a great group tonight. Great ideas room comments and questions all night, keeping us going. Candace. That's that one. Ravelon 1. That's a cool name, actually. Thomas Tyson. Excellent, sir. Oprah Winfrey. Uh-oh. The Oprah spectacle. Kat, thanks so much for being out there. Fabulous crowd tonight. Best chat room on YouTube anywhere. No question about it. The Ideas Room is a cut above, and I've learned so much from the Ideas Room and from everything that you guys have brought forward. So all I can do is say thank you. And this is something that we're working on together for sure. The deeper we go in the hot zone, the more we need you. Yeah.
Empress Anaya is dying for a shout out.
Empress Anaya. Woo, give me a shout out. Hey, listen, sometimes you just have to say, give me a shout out. It's great to have you here. Thank you for coming. Golden Girl. Y'all Brock. I like that. Music is God's gift to man. Scarlet Fire. Right on. What is that quote from? Walter Savage Landor. Huh. Wow.
Queen of the quotes.
Interesting. Booty Yoga, Marty Ross, Golden Girl, Caritas. The gang's all here. Everyone, we'll see you all next week. Have a fantastic evening and have a great weekend as well. Thank you, Mrs. Hemptress. Way to go. It's great to see everyone. Make sure you're on the newsletter list. Go to darkjournalist, as I said.com, and we will see you all next Friday. And you know,
hold on. I just want to say, and thank you everybody for your prayers and healing energy. I got over my flu very quickly.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Remarkable.
And I dropped a couple pounds. So there you go.
Nicely done.
Starting spring off right.
Excellent. Well, look, is there anything more valuable than good health?
Nothing.
Let's think
when you're
about
sick, you realize it.
Unbelievable. So great for everyone to be with us. You know, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends. I had one last thing.
There's always a pile left over.
You know, oh boy.
Oh no. We're going back in.
I'll get to it next week. We'll see y'all next week.
God bless.